All right. I am now joined by Jacobin producer and right now GTAA producer, um, Life producer, Cale Brooks. Also, kind of a Vivek Chibber super fan, so should be good for this debate.
I have this behind me so you don't see all the posters. That's the
Fair enough. And econ professor and current affairs magazine writer, House economist, Rob Larson.
Evening.
So I guess two off-topic things before we get started on setting up and then watching this debate. One of them is my apologies if my sound is weird tonight. Jen and I literally took we're in Massachusetts and we just got back from, being on the road all day today and yesterday, and I have not completely unpacked yet. So I don't have the microphone that I normally have for this. It was a good, it was a good weekend. Intense weekend. I got to see where Michael Brooks is buried in Amherst, which I've been meaning to do for quite some time. And the second thing is that this has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, and everything to do with what's the episode tomorrow. In fact, the timing worked out very well because we've had it on the books for a few weeks that Derek Davison and Daniel Bester are going to be on, and we're going to do a foreign policy episode. So the last helicopter out of Saigon, scenes from Afghanistan were just like very considerately timed for that episode. But since that is all going on right now, before we watch this debate from 2019, I think it's worth saying just a minute about. We'll obviously say much more on the episode tomorrow. But certainly where my head goes watching all this, I talked about this a little bit on the Majority Report on Friday. But I don't know. I mean, I'm an old man. I remember 2001. And I remember what it was like in 2001 if you were like me, the kind of like wild-eyed Chomsky lunatic who actually thought that the United States should not invade Afghanistan. That was a pretty lonely position in the fall of 2001. Not a lot of support for that. I think that polled at around 10%. And I don't know what the margin of error was to get it up to 10%. Certainly anecdotally, it felt like a lot less than that. But that was like late 2002 when I started to go to protests against the oncoming invasion of Iraq. Even people who agreed with me about that, would often say, like, this was the sort of standard center-left thing to say. Well, I mean, Afghanistan's one thing. But we shouldn't invade Iraq. That was the sort of standard lib line about this. The very celebrated speech by not yet Senator Barack Obama opposing the war in Iraq. One of his main objections was that it was distracting us, and it was distracting resources from the far more important war in Afghanistan. And this was just the common line. I mean, if you wanted, like, it was just completely outside of the boundaries of what was imaginable in mainstream political discussion to think that the United States should not, in fact, be bombing weddings in Afghanistan and trying to reconstruct this society in ways that manifestly had very shallow support, in that society, and. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what to say about it, except fuck all you people. I told you. But if either of you has anything more eloquent to say, I'd be curious to hear it.
Yeah, it's great now seeing how 100% of people who comment were against the war the whole time now. Yeah, I remember, I was about your age at that time too. I was in college, and we had a standing demonstration in Bloomington, Indiana, where Indiana University is, before October 7th, when the bombs started falling. We were proud to be in front of it. It's a grim, ugly thing to see it ending. But I mean, at the minute we started looking at the exit door, the entire national military collapsed, just like Iraq's did when ISIS attacked a couple of years ago. It was all just a giant grift structure with phantom units and everything else exactly the same. So it's an ugly thing to see, but it's inevitable as soon as we decided to stop spending $1 trillion every 10 years to stay there. So it's a ugly milestone.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, it's, you bringing up 2004 and kind of Obama's, his speech and where the Democrats were at that point. I mean, Kerry was running as the, I will manage the war better than Bush candidate. And obviously Biden's policy is not that anymore, but you can see the chronology of how it slid down from, I would be the better manager, to, okay, well, we probably shouldn't be in there, to, okay, we are in fact evacuating, but there isn't really much of a plan outside of that. And it seems like what the Biden administration is doing right now of deploying more troops, saying that the point is to then get those who are still in the country out of the country, that it's a means of exiting. Great, I suppose, in this, if that's truly what's happening, if we are in fact exiting. But it's, while it's obviously a good thing that we're finally leaving the country, I mean, we should never ever forget just like how much carnage we brought to that region. The fact that, like, yes, it's important that we're no longer the ones dictating what's going on in that country, but so much of the fallout of the situation people are in today is directly from our actions for 2 decades. And to me, it's still kind of an open question of what progressive foreign policy actually means. Certainly Biden isn't going to be the one pursuing it. We have people like Danny Bessner and others who are trying to formulate this, but to me, it still seems fairly oblique. And I think that is a major task that the left has to take up at some point, assuming that we actually do care about managing, America, the US, that we actually do want to run the state and government, and like we actually do have to have like a realistic, serious sense of what American foreign policy should be, such that it is progressive and it is actually promoting the advancement of like genuine rights, like not Sam Moyn capital HR human rights in the sense that it's just like the window dressing for American empire, but the genuine expansion of resources and power and social rights around the world. I don't know what that is yet. It's something that I think it's worth reflecting on, and hopefully we can get into that tomorrow. But
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that the question of what we would do, if we actually, like, the left actually held state power, and what that would mean in terms of foreign policy, I completely agree, is an extremely underexplored question, partially because the socialist left has been profoundly resigned for such a long time to not holding power. And I think that as part of that discussion, I mean, we need to push for a broader array of things. People talk about, the Taliban is doing this or that terrible thing, we need to do something. But of course, doing something in American imperial discourse always means bombing someone or invading someone. Doing something, I think Danny has interesting things to say about sort of international solidarity at the civil society level, but doing something could also just mean like, hey, what would actually be something that we could do that would concretely help people who'd be suffering under the Taliban? Let them move to the United States. That's a something that is entirely unlike reshaping Afghan society, which it turned out the United States utterly lacked the capacity to do. I mean, put aside the morality of it, utterly lacked the capacity to do it. letting in a shit ton more refugees is something that's absolutely within the capacity of the American state, and that's something that should certainly be happening right now. But I think it's certainly. I mean, maybe this is too obvious to belabor too much, But I mean, like I think about, I'm writing this thing about Christopher Hitchens. I mean, I think about like this sort of at his low point, in that last decade, that the sort of delusion that that Hitchens bought into about how the American state was going to be this force for bringing about positive change in the Middle East and elsewhere. I mean, this is something that was so core to the project. Again, people who thought that we shouldn't be in Iraq still thought we should be in Afghanistan. I remember wearing my hippie, Justice Not Revenge, pin in late 2001, and and the conversations that got me in, I didn't get a lot of support, for that at the time, as I'm sure anybody who was around and had a similar experience, can remember.
Revenge is just too sweet. It's just tastes too good.
But like at this point, I mean, Jesus Christ, like the United States was in Afghanistan for 20 years, far longer than Vietnam, and 20 years, couple thousand American soldiers, many more American mercenaries, and if you add it all up, something like 100,000 Afghans died over the course of that time. God knows how many millions underwent like life-destroying traumas, like having like a family member's wedding be bombed, and for what? I mean, what has it achieved? Like if you go, I mean, whatever. I should save this for tomorrow night, but I mean, like just to wrap up the thought. I mean, if you go through the checklist of the things that this war was supposed to achieve, none of them happen. I mean, it's 20 years of bloodshed to reset to the pre-2001 status quo. So, good job, guys. But I guess to pivot to Vivek Chibber, I was actually thinking about a article that he wrote for Catalyst, which for people who aren't familiar with it, that's something like an academic journal that's affiliated with Jacobin. And this is fall 2020. Chibber wrote this really good article called Orientalism and Its Afterlives, which is basically a critique of Edward Said and his legacy. And it's not, for people who are familiar with these debates in an intimate way, he's not breaking totally new ground here. He's synthesizing a lot of the points made by previous critics, kind of Marxist critics of, of the sort of limits and analytic deficiencies what Said is doing. But he's got this opening paragraph where he's sort of giving credit where credit's due, and he says towards the end of that paragraph, right, he says there are some respects in which Said's replacement of colonialism at the center of the modern era has had a salutary effect not just on scholarship but also on politics. Even as the left went into retreat in the neoliberal era, even as working class parties either shrank in influence or were absorbed into the mainstream, the centrality of anti-imperialism surprisingly remained close to the center of left discourse, an achievement in no small part attributable to Said's great book, by which he means Orientalism. That's what he's talking about here. And even as class politics is reemerging after its long hiatus, it is impossible to imagine a future in which the left in the core countries will ever repeat its sometimes baleful disregard for imperial aggression and for the aspiration of the laboring classes in the global South. This recalibration of the left's moral compass, Said's Orientalism, continues to play an important role. And so, I was kind of thinking about that, both in terms of, about to watch Vivek Chibber talk about socialism, and that reemergence of class politics that he's talking about, is obviously the backdrop of it. but also again with the collapse of this like ridiculous house of cards that the United States spent 20 20 years shoveling money and corpses into in Afghanistan. That recalibration of the moral compass that he's talking about there, that anti-imperialism, remaining close to the center of left discourse, the thing that, despite their larger ideological disagreements, the thing that he and Said, agree on, is something that I wanted to kind of give that its due at the beginning before we kind of turn to the debate.
Right. I mean, so this debate won't have. I don't think there's any mention of Said in there. But
No.
And I thought here, I'll send you the link. I actually thought you were going to bring up a different article of his, a Socialist Register piece from 2009, Chibber's explanation of why we ended up going to war in Iraq, which is a good piece that people should check out. But your point, I think the quote that you read from the Said piece in Catalyst, I think is useful in the sense that, yes, like the left is probably morally the most anti-imperialist it's been. Not
Right.
that the left has previously not been anti-imperialist. In fact, the left has historically been like the only part of society that's been truly anti-imperialist.
Right.
But part of Said's legacy has been, being able to make a critique of empire without necessarily dealing with capitalism, which in some ways has broadened, the amount of people who can now make a critique of empire. It's in some ways been inviting to have somewhat of a more internationalist view. And at the same time, it's also, I think, greatly diminished our conceptual understanding of global capitalism. In many ways, like if the positive aspects of Said and Orientalism has been this expansion of invitation to people being able to criticize American empire, it's also meant that critique has largely been drained of class analysis. It doesn't consider capitalism as the core of the problem in kind of the global, social order, the social structure of the entire world at this point. That we're living in the most globalized form of capitalism we've ever had on this planet. And yet, the left probably has like the most limited critique of global capitalism that it's had since, I don't know, maybe the 60s. And so it's a very strange place to be. And I think there is like a massive need for greater, class analysis when it comes to this. But
So I mean, I guess tying together the threads and then going to the debate, obviously, like I said, I mean, I was just kind of thinking about that line about the sort of, Chibber kind of acknowledging the importance of anti-imperialism and why that should always be central. Before we talk about this, of course, the debate is not about foreign policy at all, and in fact, that's probably something that he and Munger have some, limited agreement on, because Munger's a libertarian, so he might well have some good anti-war views. I don't know, but I think also what you're talking about, Cale, is relevant even there, right? Because there's going to be, that sometimes libertarians on the left do have some limited convergence in terms of looking at, wars and bombings and interventions and saying, "Oh, that's bad. Don't do that." Which is not nothing. That's definitely a something. But also, of course, what the libertarian can't bring to that is a plausible analysis of why these things happen in the first place, and how we could reorder society so they don't happen, right? Like that I mean, if you don't, if ultimately you think the economic status quo is great, you just wish it didn't, result in imperialism. I mean, that is ultimately a little bit like saying that I don't know, like if you're boiling water in a tea kettle, you approve of the boiling, but you disapprove of the sound that the kettle makes, when it's ready. And it's like, I don't know, guys.
But Ben, if you just plug your ears, is it really there? Yeah. I mean, that is the libertarian solution to that problem.
Yeah. Rob, did you have a point you wanted to make before we?
Yeah. This is all very reasonable. I always think of with libertarians and foreign policy. It's we should be like fundamentally on the same side. International violence, insanely expensive state action, but it's unpredictable. With libertarians, I mean, we've talked on the show like a lot about the different stripes they come in, and are they more purist, or are they more pragmatic? And a lot of the times, as libertarians, especially back in the Cold War, especially, they'd say, well, of course, we don't want America to be overthrowing this government. It's statism, but they're preventing that from becoming statist, socialist, Soviet sphere regime. So by keeping it in the West, we keep our companies able to invest there. That's going to help these people. So often enough, they'll be willing to give a smushy, accommodation to U.S. Foreign policy and overthrowing governments. But these days, now that it's just straight like naked power plays, and they don't have that kind of, anti-socialist global Cold War fig leaf to hide behind, I think we're seeing at least a little bit less of it. But it's unpredictable, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to be fair, like the Ayn Rand types actually were often pretty hawkish, but but yeah, I mean, you had your Milton Friedmans and whatnot who would say, hey, we don't want there to be all these wars, and presumably also that we don't want the CIA to be toppling democratically elected governments in other countries, but at the same time, Friedman, would like go down to Chile to give Pinochet economic advice. So do with that what you want. But in any case, the economic advice part is it's what's most relevant to the debate we're going to watch. I just wanted to kind of start out by giving that its due, because I'm sure it's on many people's minds. It's certainly on my mind tonight. But I am really looking forward to this debate. Cale, you want to really quickly set us up in any way, or should we just go for it?
It's probably worth it to just go for it. Again, I think there's nothing I could say. I think it's set up pretty well on its own, actually. So we can.
All right, sounds good.
Yeah.
Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's debate. My name is Matt Zwolinski. I am a professor of philosophy here at the University of San Diego and director of USD's Center for Ethics, Economics, and Public Policy, which is sponsoring this afternoon's debate. The mission of the center is to promote a better understanding of social and political issues by bringing together ideas in a way that transcends traditional disciplinary and ideological boundaries. We do that through a number of events, including a biennial debate series. We have one debate on a big issue of public policy each semester. And then we also sponsor a number of smaller events, panels on different issues of public policy. Our topic for today is socialism. For most of the last century, it was simply unimaginable that any politician who self-identified as socialist in the United States could achieve any kind of serious political success. But things may be starting to change. Bernie Sanders' 2016 bid for the presidency generated tremendous excitement among voters, especially among young voters. And the success of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's 2018 bid for Congress suggests that excitement for democratic socialism is both lasting and not limited to the personality of one individual. Indeed, according to a Gallup poll published in August of last year, a majority of Democrats no longer hold a positive view of capitalism, while nearly 60% of them do have positive feelings towards socialism. So our question for tonight is socialism the wave of the future for the United States? What are the best moral and economic arguments in favor of socialism? And what do the ablest defenders of capitalism have to say in response to those arguments? And what, while we're at it, does the idea of socialism even mean today in our current political system? As always with these debates, our goal for you this afternoon is to present you with the best arguments on both sides of the issue. This is not a contest to see who can win by scoring the most rhetorical points against the other side. It is, at least as I conceive of it, a collaborative search for truth. One that will enable you to walk away with a better understanding of your own position, whatever that might be, with a better understanding of the other side's position, and with a better understanding of where those two positions differ, and just as importantly, where they converge. I'm grateful to the support of the University of San Diego for making this debate possible, to the Institute for Humane Studies, which has helped provide financial and logistical support for this event, and to the supporters of the Center for Ethics, Economics, and Public Policy, including Charles Wax and James Brennan, who have joined us here this afternoon. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce our two debaters. Michael Munger is professor of political science, economics, and public policy at Duke University and a leading scholar in the field of public choice. In addition to 200 articles and papers published in professional journals and edited volumes, Professor Munger has 7 books, including Choosing in Groups, published in 2015, and most recently, Tomorrow 3.0, Transaction Costs and the Sharing Economy. Vivek Chibber is professor of sociology at New York University, the editor of Catalyst, a journal of theory and strategy published by Jacobin Magazine, the author of Post-Colonial Theory and the Spectre of Capital, and also the ABCs of Capitalism, some copies of which might be available outside after the debate. All right, so our format for this evening, each speaker will have 15 minutes to present their opening argument. After that, they will have 5 minutes to rebut the other side's opening argument, and then we will turn to a brief period of moderated discussion and then open question and answer period. So without any further delay, I'm going to turn things over to our first debater, Vivek Chibber.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks all of you for coming. It's true that, at least in my lifetime, I not only have never seen such a question posed in a public setting, but I was absolutely sure I never would. The fact that it is says something about how the political culture has shifted in this country quite dramatically and in a very short period of time. So that being said, let me get to the point. The question is it time for the United States to embrace socialism? And any meaningful answer to that requires first a definition of what we mean by that so that we all know that we're on the same page. I will take socialism now to mean 2 things. A set of principles about what is good and bad, fair and unfair in the world, and then a set of institutions to further and that to embody and institutionalize those principles. I think for socialists, there are 3 main principles that most of them can agree upon. And I'm going to say these in a kind of minimal way. Minimally, all socialists agree, first of all, that the market should not be the arbiter of people's fate, their well-being, so it has to be constrained in some way. For some socialists, that means abolishing the market altogether. For other socialists like myself, it means simply reducing its scope. Secondly, economic decision makers, people who actually are holding investable funds, the wealth-creating funds of society, they have to be democratically accountable in some way so they don't have unilateral power over people's lives. And thirdly, that the inequalities in wealth and income should not be allowed to translate into inequalities in political power. That politics should, as much as possible, be a domain in which people participate with more or less equal resources and equal say, which massive inequalities in wealth tend to undermine. So those are the 3 principles that I think socialists agree upon. Now, what about the institutions that embody this? Well, again, there's a few here that I think all socialists can agree upon. First of all, a significant expansion of the welfare state so that at the very least, the basic needs of people are provided to them on a decommodified basis. What we mean by decommodified basis is your ability to acquire essential goods for your livelihood and for your well-being shouldn't depend on your performance in the labor market, whether or not you have a job, how good the job is, how much money you have, those sorts of things. Second, a massive increase in taxation on economic and wealth so that the material inequalities between people in society can be reduced. The justification for this tends to be of many kinds, but at the very least, what it means is it will reduce the extent of political inequalities, and it also increases the likelihood of some kind of social solidarity in society, a sense of community, which vast inequalities tend to rip apart. And that sense of community is important to hold together the institutions of a fair and a just society. And thirdly, simply either taking out of the market or massively regulating what's called the commanding heights of the economy. This means things like infrastructure, healthcare, banks, finance, these sorts of things, which are the pillars on which a modern capitalist society runs. So these are the basic institutional requirements, I think, for what a feasible socialism will be. The extent to which we move forward on them varies from socialist to socialist, but all agree on basically reducing the scope of the market, increasing the scope of planning and reducing the ability for people with lots of money to have lots of political influence as well. All right, that's what I'm going to mean by this.
Take notes. That's socialism.
Question then, again, is it time for the US to embrace socialism? The answer is a resounding yes. It is indeed that time. And now I'm going to try to give you some arguments as to why that's the case. The main reason we say on the left that it's time to embrace socialism is simple. It's that an unfettered market, an unregulated and uncontrolled capitalist economy significantly reduces the autonomy of individuals and their ability for self-determination. This is the fundamental goal that socialists since Marx have had, in spite of these monstrosities like Stalinism, in spite of all the crimes that the Bolshevik regime committed. The goal that always motivated and inspired socialists or people to socialism was what Marx called organizing human arrangements to maximize the chances for human flourishing. And what human flourishing requires more than anything else is autonomy, self-determination. And the market, socialists say, while it does at times and in certain ways provide opportunities for autonomy, it is also the domain of a massive concentration of economic power, which squelches the autonomy of the vast majority. Now, how does it do that and why? Well, there are many markets. There's not a market in capitalism. So when we say the market does this, what do we mean? Well, whatever other market there is in capitalism, for whatever goods you have a market for, the one defining element of a capitalist economy is a market for labor power, what we call the labor market. Now, the main difference between libertarians and socialists really comes down to their conceptualization, their understanding of how the labor market works. In the left's understanding of the labor market, it is not a domain for the unfettered exercise of free choice. Indeed, it is a domain where there is a massive concentration of power and a massive inequality between the leverage and the bargaining options between employer and employee. Because in the labor market, employers have enormously more resources and more power than their employees, they are able to set the terms of the labor exchange in a way that benefits them, and typically benefits them that in a fashion that constrains not just the autonomy of their employees, but does so to their detriment, to the detriment of their well-being. How? Employees, the fundamental, the various aspects of the labor contract are set by the employer. And what this means is the employer has power to set wages, working hours, how long the employee is going to work for him, the working conditions. That involves things like safety. It involves things like the pace of work. And finally, of course, because the employer has control over 8, 10, 12 hours of the employee's life while he or she is at the workplace, it also gives the employer indirect control and influence over the employee's life outside the workplace. Because of the exhaustion, because of the enormous physical costs that very fast paces of work, long hours imposes on the employee, it means when they're away from the workplace, much of their time is spent simply recuperating, getting ready to work again. For many employees today, underwork is a major problem because employers want maximum flexibility in how much time any given employee works for them, which means that employees now on any given day don't know when they're going to be called in, which obliterates the very idea of free time. Because what they're doing most of the time is either sitting by the phone in case their employer calls, or because they're not getting enough hours at one venue, they have to seek out other employment. With other employment means they have to be now on the phone waiting for 2 employers to call them. What this means is the entire life of the employee is essentially colonized by the employer. This is because the employer calls the shots of when you work, how long you work, and in what fashion you work, not the employee. Now, this concentration of power in the last 50 years we've seen also breaks the connection, which is many people think is an essential component of economic justice. It breaks the connection between effort and reward. Because employers have the power to make first call on whatever revenues their employment, their firm or their establishment is getting, the employers set the terms on how much the employees will get and how much they will get. In conditions where employers have unfettered power, which is what the United States has had the last 50 years, it means that the proportion of the total income that goes to the owner of a venue or the CEO increasingly has very little connection to their actual contribution. So 40 years ago, CEOs in the United States earned money in proportion to their employees to the ratio of like 35 to 1. By 2000, it had gone up to 350 to 1, 380 to 1. Now, it's inconceivable if you follow marginal productivity theory that CEOs suddenly were contributing 10 times more to the product than their workers were. There was one and only one reason why their pay went so much, increased so much faster than their employees: power. They could simply call the shots and take all the money for themselves, whether directly through the revenues of the firm or through the stock market. Now, this being the case, it means that the essential promise that the market makes to people, which is if you work hard, you will get the returns, the market itself is in fact undermining. And finally, in politics, the massive concentration of wealth, the massive concentration of economic resources translates into a massively greater influence in political power. This I should not have to by now rehearse, but let me just say the basic facts. Most working people know this. Opinion polls show that for the past 50 years, the majority of the American population has felt two things: that the political system is unresponsive to them and the political system is captured by the wealthy. When asked directly, as late as 2015, 80% of Americans said the American government favors the rich more than it favors the poor. The result: cynicism. Half the American electorate opts out of American elections, and it's by and large the poorer half. They feel that the system's been captured. The reason Bernie Sanders' campaign has taken off the way it has is because for the first time in 100 years, a major politician in this country is saying it doesn't have to be this way. The poor, working people have as much right to have an influence in the political system as what he says, the millionaires and billionaires. Yeah. I only have 15 minutes. So I will not read you the litany of numbers that tends to be overwhelming, but I'm sure you all know by now the story of the last 40 years. For the first time in American history, real wages have been stagnant for 2 generations. There's this famous graph, it looks like an alligator's mouth. What it shows is trends in productivity increases aligned with trends in real wages. What you've seen since 1973 in this country is that productivity increase has gone up rapidly, while real wages have been almost stagnant. And what that means is almost all the increase in income has gone to the top 10% of this population. What the most recent research shows is that 85% of all the income increases since 1980 have gone to the top 10%. The bottom 90% has had to share 15% of the increase in productivity. The bottom 50% has gained nothing. Working hours have gone up. Why? Wages are stagnant. Of course, working hours have gone up. As working hours grow up, what happens? Injuries increase, fatigue increases. For the first time since World War I, the lifespan of the typical white male in the United States has gone down. Why? The main reason that's given? Despair. Their pensions have disappeared. Their retirement has disappeared. They're in their 40s to 60s. They can't get new jobs. There's no one looking out there for them. Despair has led to the opioid crisis, a drugs crisis, and a health crisis. All right, well, all of these things have been accompanied, of course, by a quite dramatic capture of political power by the wealthy. The numbers on that are also clear. All right, so this is the background against things like the Sanders campaign, things like Ocasio-Cortez, the coming back of socialism into the political agenda. So what does it mean? I very airily gave you some ideas of what it meant earlier. Let me now be more specific. One thing it does not mean is the Soviet-style one-party state, centralized planning that we saw in the communist world from the Bolshevik Revolution into the 1970s. Very few people on the left advocate for that anymore. Why? Well, first of all, obviously, it is the opposite of self-determination when you have a one-party autocracy ruling over you. Secondly, maybe centralized planning can work, but there's no evidence that it can. We've seen no evidence for it. So what most socialists will now argue for is not that model of socialism. What they will argue for is setting up institutions that will enable the principles that I enunciated later to be instantiated. What will those institutions mean? Well, first of all, I think, I said earlier, taking massive sections of the economy out of the commodified zones and making their goods available on a decommodified basis. What are these? I think a viable socialism has to mean a government-run system of several parts of the economy. One is healthcare. Healthcare should not be left up to the private sector. Second, education. Education is not a place for the private sector. Right now, we're still in the midst of this craze around charter schools. There is no evidence that charter schools consistently do better than public schools, and most of them are actually funded on public monies anyway. It's a complete boondoggle. There should not be any privately funded primary and secondary education. Thirdly, housing. Housing should be a social right. Cheap, affordable, and good housing should be provided by the government, not the slums that they've been building for the last 80 years. Half of Hong Kong lives in public housing. It's hardly something like Cabrini in Chicago. It is good housing, and there's no reason why you can't have good housing provided by the state. Transportation, of course you can have cars. Of course you can have your own, but every major city should have good, cheap, and high quality public education. And in the United States, there needs to be a viable national system of rail transport. And if you ask me, these airlines should be nationalized yesterday. Privately funded media is dying. It won't exist a few years from now because the traditional model of media finance, which was advertising based, is collapsing. Advertisers have now bolted from print media. They're never coming back. They bolted from television. They're never coming back. If there's going to be a future for media in this country, it's only going to come through a massive influx of public monies into it, massive influx of some kind of public support for it. So that's another sector that I think should be, in substantial measure, be given over to the public sector. Public utilities should not be privately run. Public utilities were, for decades on end, public entities, and they should go back to being public entities. All right, what does that leave? Quite a bit. It means a lot of what you consume privately. It means a lot of consumption goods, restaurants, movies, a lot of entertainment is still going to be privately run in the model that I'm saying. But it's not trivial that you'll have taken out more than half of this country's GDP from the commodified sector into some kind of government provision. That necessarily means some conception of planning as well. There's going to be some degree of planning that goes into the provision of all these goods. So it does conform in this manner to the traditional conception of what socialism is. Now, these are all the pillars of what it'll be. The second thing a socialist, the call for socialism involves then is a question of strategy. If you're planning on taking over whatever, 30, 40, 50, 60% of the economy and making it now publicly provided, you're talking about a fantastic attack on private capital. And they're not going to lie down and take it willingly. So any call for socialism also has to be a call for a political strategy. And the essence of that political strategy is that a call for socialism involves enabling and creating the institution for the organization and the mobilization of the poor. Historically, every case, whether it's Western Europe, whether it's the Global South, where anything like these institutions were built up that I'm arguing for, it came on the back of a massive and a mobilized labor movement. One reason why in the United States in the past 50 years you've seen a retreat on every one of these fronts is because of the collapse of the labor movement. So part of the socialist strategy, I think part of the call for socialism has to be a political vision that moves away from this idea that it's technocrats and enlightened politicians that simply deliver these goods from on high. It's going to have to come through the politics of this country reawakening, and in particular, reawakening of that sleeping giant, which is the poor, their capacity for social movements, their capacity for social change. If this can be done, if this can come together, I actually think it's not only possible, but it's more or less inevitable that we're going to see a change in the direction that I'm defending. Thank you.
The crowd goes wild.
Yeah. So I have some thoughts, but Rob, you want to start up?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah, you can see why Vivek has the reputation he has and why he's so respected. I mean, this is what you hope to see when you watch one of these, is a socialist who can really, come out with his dukes up and do a good job being appealing. Explaining socialism along the lines of those principles and institutions, like that was very clear. I mean, my only thought there is it's just kind of lengthy, like I like to break it down people like short little summary sentences, and then maybe you explain more. Like I always, like to say it's worker control of the economy and less power in the hands of money and stuff. But like that's extremely clear, and that's like very appealing. He doesn't shy away from talking about changing the amount of individual autonomy, which is easy to chicken out of taking head on. So I thought that was pretty cool. I loved the trashing marginal productivity theory by pointing out CEO pay explodes vertically after Reagan and Clinton sort of take the legal leashes off it. along with their political parties. Like, that's great. Like, I'll just throw this in as an economist. Often people cannot believe the things that we in economics treat as just like basic rock bottom foundational realities. And one of those is marginal productivity theory. If you're more productive, you're more valuable, and someone's going to recognize that sport and hire you and give you a ton of money. And if the CEOs are getting paid that much, they must just be amazing. Any realistic analysis is, yeah, but I've heard that CEOs help pick the board members and they decide who gets the checks. Like, any person on the street can recognize that there's a lot of power at the top of these economic organizations. But marginal productivity theory is how most of my field views it. So I love that that was a thing he put an axe in the face of right away. And just the only other bit that I thought was especially very good was really early. He brought up that like the heart of the issue is the labor market. Like, that's the big issue, like how that works and so on. And he mentioned very, very accurately, and this is exactly how I would go after it personally, is like that's where the power of it is. Like, the capitalists have the power because you have concentration of property and wealth, and you can't just start a business like that. You need access to capital to rent your storefront or just put your dumb website up on a cloud, and that's the whole thing, is access to capital. And so one thing I always like to throw in for listeners here is to make these things come from people who the right, and especially like, younger rightists who are still coming into it, who they see as like safe, established voices. So I always like to turn to Adam Smith, who said, anytime you have a dispute between masters and workers, he says, in all such disputes, the masters can hold out much longer.
Right.
A landlord, a farmer, a manufacturer, a merchant, they could generally live a year or two on the stocks they've already acquired. Many workmen could not subsist a week. Few could subsist a month without employment. Like, that's from these guys. Like, I enjoy that to be the tip of the spear when I'm in this kind of debate moment. I think that's nice, but very little to complain about with Vivek's opener here. A lot of respect. You can see how this stature was earned.
Yeah, I liked everything that was in it. I think there's something important that wasn't in it, although I'm actually curious why not, because I think it was entailed by some stuff that he did say, but it wasn't spelled out at the point that I think that I was expected to be spelled out. But yeah, I like what he did say a lot. I guess I like the point about community, which is can tell that the man has really internalized his G.A. Cohen from Why Not Socialism, where Cohen talks about how you have this sort of what he calls the bourgeois conception of equality of opportunity, which is basically that you have equality of opportunity as long as there's no legal impediment to you competing in market interactions, and you have what he calls left liberal equality of opportunity, which is starts from that foundation, but then says, okay, clearly there are certain kinds of social impediments to competing on an equal field, and we'll try to remedy those, like Head Start programs, are an obvious attempt to implement, that sort of left liberal conception of equality of opportunity. But then he says the socialist equality of opportunity, which is where you say literally the only thing that should lead to inequality is the only things that should lead to any inequalities in distribution of resources are things that are actually under your control. So you shouldn't have a class of the population that is doing, and I'm not using class in the precise Marxist sense, just the colloquial sense, that you shouldn't have a class of the population that is doing manual labor, doing far worse than a class of the population who happen to have, forget social assets, even just the particular set of skills and abilities that help you climb some sort of professional managerial class ladder, and have some material inequality between these. because that's not under your control. But then Cohen also says that there might even be certain inequalities that you could technically justify by his preferred principle of socialist equality of opportunity that we should still disallow, because if you have inequality past a certain point, it makes it impossible to have a sense of community. And he gives the example of like somebody who does own a car. If they have to go on the bus one day, your wife is using the car, and you're talking to somebody who can't afford a car, you wouldn't start complaining to them about how you couldn't, you had to take the bus that day because obviously they can never, they can never drive a car because they can't afford one. That's his example about sense of community.
Right,
so
or even just like simpler than that. Like Chibber would totally agree with like the MLK quote that what's the point of the Negro having the right to sit at the lunch counter if he can't afford the meal, or if there still aren't enough jobs for him to make a livable income, or to steal Bernie Sanders' phrase when he was debating Ted Cruz a couple of years ago on healthcare. Access doesn't mean a damn thing. That like you have access to purchase enough stocks to have ownership rights over a company, but workers don't have the means to do that. Like that's not an actual viable option for them, like an economic path in front of them, because like structurally the vast majority of working class people are stuck in precarity. And
actually that's a good reminder. I watched that debate a couple times when it first happened, back in 2017. But yeah, actually we should do that for some debate breakdown. That'd be a fun one to do. I remember Bernie having a line in there about how in that same sense of access, right? He has access to Donald Trump's houses. He could buy them,
right.
But like see how much good that does him. So I liked all of that, and I think the normative principles that he started out with are exactly the right ones. Which, while we're tracing all of the analytic Marxist DNA in here, I mentioned the Cohen inheritance. This is a miracle and right, swimming around in the bloodstream there. The way that he's framing that. About you have basically the normative impulses that socialist politics come from are one about everybody having their needs met, that they shouldn't rely on the market to have these met, and the other one is about autonomy, is about about whether you're meaningfully in control of your life and of economic outcomes that affect you. And this is where the one thing that I did think was kind of missing came in, because that second normative principle, is not obviously satisfied by what he's talking about later on, which are all more or less, even though they do encompass quite a bit of the economy, as he points out. I mean, he's absolutely right to say all of these things would involve massive amounts of class struggle to actually achieve. But he's really talking about the entailment of the first principle there, that you shouldn't rely on the market to have your needs met. But that still doesn't quite satisfy the second one, and he's talking later on about, in particular, the disagreement between socialists and libertarians is about the labor market, and which we talked about a little bit, I think, on the post game last week, about how whether you understand that labor market is just fundamentally unlike other kinds of market interactions.
Yeah.
That you say, oh yeah, on some sufficiently abstract level of analysis in any kind of market, you're buying and selling things, but this is just different because your relationship to your labor power is just not the same thing as your relationship to other goods that you might be buying or selling. That you're surrendering all of this autonomy for 8 out of every 16 waking hours, and it's only 8, because of the victories of past worker struggles.
Yeah. And the other part is that, unlike other commodities, you can't hold out to find a better buyer, because what you're selling is attached to your material carbon body. And if you don't sell, you will not get what you need in order to buy clothing, to buy food, to pay your rent. And so you have to sell yourself basically as soon as you can. You can't sit around waiting. Unemployment checks have been helpful, but for a lot of people, that's barely, like, that really doesn't suffice people's needs.
Yeah.
And a lot of minimum wages don't suffice people's needs. That it's like, it's the reality of our situation, where like employers have total domination over the working class, where they will drive you down below subsistence wages to the point where they only care about if you're going to come into work the next day, and they don't care how you made it, how you fed yourself to get there. So that's like, in that dynamic that's internal to capitalist labor markets, like, it's fundamentally a question of power, and it's completely different than any other market that there is. And like you say, he's made this point, and I totally agree with it, that like, this is the distinction that, like, I think I don't really understand how any libertarian can refute this, that just like, you have to deny reality at that point to say that working class people are not in this situation.
Yeah, what are you gonna say, Rob?
Oh, it's funny. We're just building off what Cale was saying there. Like, the way I always put it is, like, people just need to recognize it's not a sentimental thing, but like, people aren't products. We make markets, and maybe they work, maybe they don't, for making car components and processed foods and stuff. But human beings, you have to eat every day, and people often have kids and families. You have to feed them every day. I read that in a book. You have to feed kids all the time. It's ridiculous. Like, you can't treat people like some commodity, like, copper or, transistors. Like, oh, the market's weak, we're having a recession year. All right, big deal. We'll live off our existing earnings, and next year we'll sell twice as many. We'll make it up then. You can't do that with your family. You can't tell your kid, I'll feed you twice as many lunches next year. Shut up. Like, that doesn't work. So I like that too. Anyway, also realize that how.
I always think of the Simpsons. When they're going to get a new dog to replace or alongside Santa's little helper. They say this, it's a really fancy dog, and Homer says, "This is the kind of dog you have to feed every day."
Right. But the other thing, like, just to kind of add to Rob's point, this is where not that like anyone but these people buy into this ideology, but like, that's why libertarians have to make this point that there are no distinctions between markets, because from the point of view of a capitalist, you do in fact want to treat your workers just like another commodity input, that like, their wage bill is just another cost for you, at a certain point. Yes, like, hopefully some capitalists still have like blood going through them, and they're human enough to see that like, these are human beings, but like, just like, their material interests are to say, no, I'm going to pay them as little as possible, just like how I would try to find the best deal on my raw materials for my products that I'm producing.
Yeah, and so I think that the thing that seemed to me to be left out is that a lot of what he was saying, a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, a lot of what he said about power, his jab at marginal productivity theory, would seem to entail something that he didn't say, or at least he didn't spell out, which is, there are these key things that we need to decommodify, because treating healthcare, for example, as a commodity is obscene and leads to socially dysfunctional outcomes, and it's just bad in human terms. Absolutely, rail systems, and love what he said about public housing, but but then, like, all right, so if we do need some things to remain commodified, that for the reasons he was kind of gesturing at, the failures of past central planning, etc., that we do, we do still need some kind of sector in which things are bought and sold, because of all those points about the labor market and power and all that stuff. The thing that I was expecting him to say, the other shoe that never quite dropped there at the end, is if we do need some sort of residual market sector, it can at least be a worker controlled market sector, so that, CEOs don't have that power to, pay themselves, whatever, 500 times, as much as everybody else at the firm. And, people have that, increased autonomy and, et cetera.
Hmm. My sense is, just a guess maybe, that everything he said, like, he's only given 15 minutes for this opening presentation, and he hits like the mark almost exactly at 15 minutes. I don't know how this guy's internal clock works, but
Better than mine.
but I think part of that, the answer would just be, I think that he was trying to lay out the most minimal version of what socialism would be, and so to the extent to which this other part of the economy, this like less than like the minority of the economy that is primarily producing commodity goods, or like things that just non-essential commodities that you're gonna I think a lot of that production, I think he would agree that it's going to be some kind of worker owned, or like at the minimally, like, working class people are going to have far greater say over what the labor contract is in those firms. But I think he probably just left it out of the presentation just to not kind of get stuck in the minutia of kind of intra-left debates over, to what extent is it going to be, unions, because like it could just be like a labor federation like you have in Sweden, where just a massively powerful labor federation has the power to negotiate with employers sectorally, and you can get really productive. I mean, they're going to talk about Sweden a little bit, actually. Just sorry to preempt it, but I mean, you'll get massive productivity, but you'll also get way greater egalitarian and humane outcomes, where like people actually they do have far greater control over their lives, and yet they don't control the workplaces in ownership terms. But in power terms, they're maybe on closer to even. Maybe in Sweden, they were never on even footing with like the capitalist class, but certainly far greater power than the American working class, or any other working class has.
No doubt about that whatsoever. I really, I think the best discussion about this is the first chapter of Bhaskar Singhara's book, The Socialist Manifesto, where he goes through these like 3 or 4 characters, one of who, well, no, actually it's actually 2, because I think that I think it's just that the one of them, they're living under a different economic system later. But basically, there's a worker at an American factory, and their equivalent in a sort of slightly idealized version of Sweden or Norway, that like sort of representing what some of these social democratic strongholds were like at their absolute best, at the sort of peak of those welfare states, and the peak, of the strength of their labor movements. And then later, essentially, there's a socialist revolution in the United States. There's a whole thing. It's about
Bruce Springsteen.
Yes, Springsteenism.
Although, just has to be said, Bruce Springsteen's doing a movie with Obama right now.
Yeah,
really disappointing. I know.
All right. Well, for the new book, we'll make sure.
I know. Bosker's got to do some revisions.
Don't call it Springsteenism, but after the triumph of Springsteenism, then the workers are in. Then the workers democratically control, the workplace, and sort of, own the firm at least outright, and essentially rent, the physical means of production from the state. And the point, of course, is that the Nordic stuff is much closer, to what we want, right? But then, like, he also wants to give you the horizon of what we actually want. And I think that, I don't want to get too far off track here. I want to get back to the debate, but I mean, I think it's important to give that horizon, even though we know that it's not like around the corner, certainly, right? Even given massive left victories, it wouldn't be around the corner. But it's important to give that horizon. I mean, I think that, like, if you look back at the at the history of the global labor movement, at even a lot of the socialists who helped build, some of those welfare states, and certainly some of the most militant, people who were fighting for it. They were motivated by the idea that they weren't just going to make things slightly better right now, but that there was some sort of long-term horizon that went beyond capitalism. That in many cases that was a tragically idealized version of what they thought the Soviet Union was. And obviously that version of it has much less persuasive power now, than it did like in the 1930s. But I think we need something, because I think if people don't have a sense that I think that you're going to get if you want like cadres, people who are going to be extremely committed over the long haul through periods of defeat, and be sort of the best fighters for whatever improvements are possible right now. Those are people who are going to be motivated by an ideological vision, and so they need to have some sense that there's something that you can have that isn't just a little bit better, but that we could structure society in a fundamentally different way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Although we should probably just call them political organizers.
You don't like cadres?
I like cadres. I feel like it's in that bucket of terms that like people hear and they're like, all right, comrade, sounds good. But I'm with you, Ben. I'm completely with you. Sorry.
Fair enough. All right. So, despite that criticism, I think certainly as an explication of the normative basis of socialist politics, the sort of guiding principles of why capitalism exists right now is such a catastrophe for working people, and of what at least some of the socialist programmatic points, are about what could be done to improve society. I think that was a masterclass, and I'm going to be very curious about how Munger's going to respond to it. So let's do that.
Thank you, Vivek. We'll now turn things over to Professor Michael Munger.
Well, hey, thanks very much for having me. I should point out that one of the rules in academics is the smarter you are, the less you have to dress up, which explains why no tie for Vivek. But I'm going to do my best nonetheless. Now, in some ways, what we're debating is not so much destinations as directions. The country stands at a crossroads. It happened that I worked as a consultant in the 1989 presidential election in Chile. And that was the first election that had happened since the CIA-assisted coup in 1973. And I remember in the discussions that I saw in 1989 in Chile thinking, I hope I never live in a country where elections are so important. Well, I have bad news. Many of us feel like the next election is going to change the world. And I do worry that whoever loses, and someone will, whatever side loses, is going to say, I don't accept this outcome. So I worry that this debate over direction is one that we have to try to take seriously and articulate exactly what we mean by our terms rather than approach it in a way that demagogues. I want to compliment Professor Chibber for having done a very good job of being clear. We often debate, although he did not, as if two ideals, market systems and communism, were possible. Let me say that many people on my side seem to have a little shrine of markets that they worship. If you ask them for an example, well, what country do you have in mind? What actual country on earth do you have in mind? That's what would happen. It would happen if we just had markets. And there are people on the left that make the same mistake. If a social system is not feasible at scale, then it cannot be desirable. The idea that we should embrace socialism in the sense of being a Soviet-style, fully planned economy is nonsense. You can't embrace a ghost, and we don't want to embrace a zombie. The question that's posed here, though, is should we embrace socialism more as a direction? That's only interesting if socialism means things we're not already doing that we have not already embraced. Now, those would include, as Professor Chibber said, state ownership and direction of the means of production of a substantial part, in fact, more than half of GDP, and state control of direction of an entire menu of prices, including wages, interest rates, and commodities, so as to ensure that prices conform with democratic and not economic goals. Problem is that there's also no examples of countries that work along those lines. Angola, Cuba, Mozambique, North Korea have such grotesque limits on political freedom and such stunted levels of prosperity, they're not worth considering. If by capitalism you mean the uncontrolled working of prices through markets, then we also don't find any examples of that we want to pursue. So the point is not whether socialism or capitalism actually exists. Neither of those can be embraced. All existing systems are mixed. What sort of existing system might we try to redirect our own system towards? Now, capitalism uses market prices to direct production. The value of resources and assets and profits are used to determine the distribution. So capitalism is a system of production and distribution. Democratic socialism uses votes and bureaucracy to direct production and subsidies and transfers to determine distribution. Those are the choices that are before us. The key reason that socialism is unworkable is that it lacks any kind of price mechanism for signaling the value and opportunity cost of resources. So a system that relies on the price mechanism can't be socialism. And a system that is socialism can't rely on the price mechanism. So the failure to control market forces, including the tendency towards cronyism that we see in the United States, are just as big a distortion of prices. It doesn't matter if some bureaucrat who's educated on the left, or if some corporate CEO who recognizes the interests of the right is the one doing the planning, that is the one who is distorting the price system. The effects are just as pernicious. So I expect we agree about that sort of price manipulation is the big danger that we see coming from the right and from cronyism. So here's the thing that I want to propose, and I'm from North Carolina. Every October we have a state fair, and at the state fair we have the beautiful pig contest. Now these are always young pigs, but imagine that we were to have a beautiful pig contest for adult pigs. Now we bring out the first of two contestants. There's only two because there's not many pretty pigs. We bring out the first pig and we look at it. Oh, that's a really ugly pig. Let's just give prize to the second pig. Well, that's what people on both sides tend to do. They look at the problems with markets and say, therefore, the state should do it. Well, wait, you're comparing the state you can imagine with markets that actually exist. And Lord knows people on the right do this. They point out problems with the state and then they compare it to the markets that they can imagine. So the question is to delineate the set of activities that we would like to try to use markets and the set of activities that we would want to use the state. So what is the argument for capitalism now that we recognize we're comparing two ugly pigs? It's actually simple. Wealth and prosperity is the result of division of labor or specialization that's directed by the price system. Now, division of labor does not require a market system, but division of labor and market systems work well together in a decentralized setting. So we're used to the sort of specialization that was present at the origins of this. If your last name is Cooper, you come from a family that used to make barrels. If you come from a family named Smith, then they made metal products. If you come from a family of bakers, then they made bread. So we're used to this idea of specialization. What happens with specialization is that people develop skills and they become more productive. They also are able to take pride in their work because they have some connection to this profession. The result of that is if I specialize and you specialize, we're creating a system of cooperative mutual exchange where I depend on you. If I'm the baker, I depend on you to be the smith. We can't live without each other. The question is how best to organize that kind of cooperation. The Industrial Revolution was the beginning of the serious application of market organization to the division of labor. And Adam Smith's famous example was the pin factory. And what he pointed out was that if you divide workers from the artisanal making of pins into many little separate steps, you could make hundreds or thousands of times as many pins. And the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, which means that markets want to be global. The advantage of markets is that they increase the breadth and quality of consumer products and they reduce the price. What markets also do, though, is destroy jobs. Throughout history, what markets have done is destroy jobs because increases in efficiency are going to drive out other companies or other workers who are less efficient. Now, that seems, and it is in fact, destructive. Even proponents of markets call it creative destruction, in fact. The advantage of it was pointed out by Adam Smith as early as 1776 in his example of the woolen coat. In Smith's example of the woolen coat, he noted that people were able to get winter coats that were of a higher quality that would have been available even to royalty just 100 years earlier, because the quantity and price, quantity went up, quality went up, prices went down, everybody could get woolen coats. Downside was that many people who used to make coats that weren't very good no longer had jobs. So there was a big increase in the amount and quality of stuff at lower price that consumers got to have. That meant a substantial reduction in poverty. What capitalism is really good at is reducing poverty, but there was a price to pay, and it was inequality. There's two really different problems that are often conflated, and I want to try to distinguish them here. One is poverty, and the other is inequality. They're not the same thing, and there's often a trade-off between them. The way to end poverty is to enable the poor to enrich themselves, so there are no poor. The end to inequality is to destroy wealth, so there are no rich people. If your primary concern is about inequality, then the goal is to destroy. If your primary goal is to solve the problem of poverty, your primary goal is to create. It's tempting to think, why not both? The problem is that doing both at the same time is not easy. Since the pro-market reforms of Deng Xiaoping in 1978, China has seen two enormous changes. First, the largest decline in poverty in history, the largest decline in human poverty in history. More than 500 people by market reforms were lifted out of extreme poverty as China's poverty rate fell from 88% in 1981 to 6.5% in 2012. 88% poverty in 1981, 6.5% poverty in 2012. Now, that's using poverty in a way that's comparable, the equivalent of US $2 less or per day. What went along with that decline in poverty? The biggest increase in inequality that the world has ever seen. China has by far the most unequal political system in the world. If you ask poor people in China who've seen a dramatic increase in their living standard, in many cases 1,000% or more in purchasing power parity terms, a lot of them are going to likely say that increased inequality was worth it because the reduction in poverty really improved their lives. Really, really poor people tend not to be so concerned about inequality. They're concerned about poverty. The question is, at what point are we not willing to accept the inequalities that are created by this system? Now, remember, by socialism, I mean a system that relies on state ownership or control of the means of production, the state direction of production decisions over a substantial, not all, but over a substantial part of the economy. Ownership solves a problem of the commons. Political incentives are often very short run, and we often hear about the problems in markets that corporate CEOs have very short run goals. Well, if you're in the US House of Representatives, how long are your goals? 2 years on November 9th. That's on November 9th. Political systems, likewise, have very short-term goals because they're focused on the next election. If you look at the pathologies of the US system, the failure to build infrastructure, the failure to address climate problems, maybe it's because it's controlled by the wealthy, but more likely it's the very short-run goals that elections induce in democracy. These are two ugly, ugly pigs. Let's look at let's make a comparison with Sweden. Now, I should point out that one of the things that these debates often look like is two amoebas trying to reach out a pseudopod and envelop Sweden. Because Sweden is the country that I would point to as being the best example of how capitalism can work. And if you look in 1990 or so, Sweden had a very substantial proportion of its total GDP that was provided by state-owned enterprises. But their growth was low, and they decided that because of failing industries, a lot of labor market regulations that made firing difficult or impossible, huge increases in labor costs. Gunnar Myrdal, the Nobel Prize winner, famously asked whether Swedes had been turned into a nation of swindlers. Sweden's economy was doing very poorly. The situation of debt and stagnation was getting worse. They turned back towards capitalism. At present, Sweden is the 19th most capitalist country in the world. If we measure that based on property rights, trade openness, freedom to use stock to create new corporations, there are more billionaires per capita in Sweden than there are in the United States, by a lot. So by that measure, at least, inequality is very high in Sweden, but there's a lot less poverty. Sweden has a lot less poverty because they have used their capitalist system to create a surplus that allows them to redistribute, to take care of the problem of poverty. The price they have paid is inequality, but that's a price worth paying because the inequality created by capitalism allows us to solve the problem of poverty in a way that nothing else does. So it was capitalism that saved Sweden. Sweden was heading downward. They were having problems with economics. They moved back to the point where they're actually in the top 10 of many measures of capitalism. Sweden is, and if you talk to someone in Sweden, you talk to Swedish government officials, they'll say, I don't know what y'all are talking about. We are a market economy. The different systems that Sweden uses are, without exception, a market economy. Sweden has a 100% universal voucher system for education. So forget charter schools, it's a voucher system. It is purely privatized. That may be a bad idea, but that's Sweden. They have a purely privatized pension system. They went from defined benefit to defined contribution that's assigned to individuals. It's invested in one of 700 private index funds. As the Prime Minister of Norway, also supposedly a socialist nation, said, the Nordic model is an expanded welfare state which uses capitalism to provide a high level of security for its citizens. But it's a successful market economy with much freedom to pursue your dreams and your lives as you wish. That was the Prime Minister of Denmark. So in terms of deregulation, business freedoms, Denmark, Finland, and Norway are 7th, 8th, and 9th most free. Sweden is 12th. The US is 15th. Those countries are the capitalist countries. If you want to embrace socialism and what you mean is capitalism, let's do that. But those are capitalist countries. If you want to move in the direction of the Northwest European states, you are saying that we should embrace capitalism. And the reason to do it is that we can use capitalism to create the surplus that will help us solve the problems of inequality. So I want to sum up, and if you only remember one thing from what I'm going to say today, it should be this. Every flaw in voters is worse in consumers. Forgive me. Every flaw in consumers is worse in voters. Every flaw in consumers is worse in voters. That is, there are people who are too stupid to be able to decide what size Coke to drink. If we gather them into a large unorganized mob, they can decide foreign policy. Because it's the same people. They don't have very good institutions to enable them to enact the sort of social movements that I agree completely with Professor Chibber is what we need. What we need to do is embrace democracy. We don't need to embrace socialism. What we need to do is embrace democracy. Now, that may just be sour grapes. I was a 2008 governor candidate for the Libertarian Party in North Carolina. I was included in 4 televised debates, but I found it very difficult to be allowed to participate in politics with the 2 state-sponsored parties who find competition very inconvenient. If we had a system that actually allowed competitive parties, if we had a system that allowed proportional representation, if we had a system that encouraged political competition, the problem is not the lack of economic competition. The problem is the lack of political competition. All we need to do is embrace democracy, and we'll be able to solve a great deal of this problem. And the other thing that I want to say is that we don't need to embrace socialism. Capitalism saved Sweden, and now Sweden can save capitalism. The Swedish model is the way to save capitalism. What we need to do is embrace democracy. Thanks for listening.
Well, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
I kind of seems like you can't quite decide what he thinks about some of this stuff. That if every flaw in consumers is worse than voters, I'm not sure why we should embrace democracy. That sounds like he's doing the typical libertarian thing and arguing against democracy, and then he changes his mind for some reason at the end. I'm not quite clear on that. But what are you guys' thoughts?
Rob, you go first.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's fun when libertarians bring up Scandinavia. It's one of two arguments. It's you say they're socialist, and they are, and that's why it sucks there. Or they'll say, yeah, they are great because they're capitalists. Like, so you got to be prepared for either one of these incorrect arguments. They're both very popular. It's interesting because, of course, yeah, I mean, you go to any of these, European social democratic states. I don't know why we have to focus on Sweden so damn much. But, of course, they've got private ownership of a lot of petty, your personal property, petty property, even some large-scale property. These countries are doing like market reforms just lately, and because the only metrics that libertarians and capitalists care about is economic growth and openness to investments to evil foreign hedge funds, you can say like, oh, they've saved Sweden now. Look, its GDP is growing, and all we had to do was take away all of its social supports and piss off everyone in the country. Like Denmark's kind of your classic case of that. Like that government's been striving so hard to embrace neoliberalism, and its electorate just gets more and more pissed off and dissatisfied with every one of these steps. So I would say for listeners, this is not like the typical sort of libertarian step, but it is like a move to say like, well, those are capitalist states that you're complaining about. To me, the big thing here is, as always, these guys want to focus on the price mechanism, which is this miraculous thing and plays a huge role in market economics where everything happens based on relative prices. And now everyone wants PPE to fight a disease, so the price goes up and companies respond to that. And it's great, except everything about it is wrong. It assumes that you've always got companies that are going to change what they want to do, and lots of our markets have monopolists or oligopolists that dominate and will ignore profitable future things because it disrupts their existing business models. But even uglier, of course, like anytime you talk about the price mechanism, if you're serious, you'll say, of course, it leaves out huge environmental and other non-immediately monetized effects. I mean, the reason why we know exactly the cost of a gallon of gasoline is because we only care about the expenses that human beings have to write checks for. Paying for the oil rig and the salaries and the pipeline and the stupid Citgo station that you pull the gas from. That's what's in that sticker price for the gasoline. Everything that happens from combusting that gasoline, so your car will go from raising sea levels to melting the ice caps to the horrible heat waves we have out here in the western part of the country every year now. Like all of that is part of your gasoline price too, but try putting all of those things into the price per gallon, of unleaded gasoline. Like it's just not practical. But by ignoring all those things, you can be just like this chucklehead and talk about how great it is that we have this price mechanism and it guides capitalism and it's so efficient. Yeah, it's efficient because you ignore all the inefficient parts to it. So there's a lot here that's very classic, libertarian meat and potatoes, and not as unusual as this sort of flirtation with Scandinavian social democracy. Maybe the only other thing I noticed is how much he wants to say, like, remember, you should recognize real institutions we have now, and anything you would just want to have, that's unserious. You could say that puts the landscape of debate in, you could say that favors the capitalist because we have capitalism now.
Right.
Sort of a self-serving guideline there, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, for the vast majority of human history, you couldn't point to any countries that abolished slavery because there weren't any. That's the thing about social progress is that it doesn't exist, until it's happened. Which is not to say that I don't think it's important for people who advocate radical change to be able to point to real world precedents every time they possibly can, because most people have a justifiable fear of flying leaps into the unknown. But like also, you can't let that be a discussion ender, or else you're just ruling out human society ever accomplishing anything that it hasn't accomplished yet. But yeah, I did, before I go to Cale, I did just want to jump on Rob's point about Scandinavia, because Munger is kind of doing a weird thing. He's doing like several of them at once, sort of throwing everything against the wall, because not all these like comfortably sit together, but he's sort of doing everything that anti-socialists do when they talk about Scandinavia all at once. So one of them is Scandinavia still, by and large, has private control of the means of production argument. So therefore, it's not socialism, which, I'm perfectly happy to say, sure, it's not, whatever, that's fine. I don't, but then that doesn't make it irrelevant to the discussion, because these are countries, some of them, right? There are vast differences between these nations' political trajectories and histories, but these are countries that have successfully beta tested lots of policies that socialists advocate, and they've worked very well in meeting people's needs in these places. And he's cherry picking like crazy, talking about Sweden's educational system. How about Finland, which is widely regarded as having the best education system in the world of any country. This is something that even a lot of people in the corporate, ed reform crowd will say. Like if you watch that old pro charter school documentary, Waiting for Superman, that they were like, when they were bashing the American public school system, they were comparing it in certain points to Finland. Well, Finland has only public schools. There are no charter schools in Finland. There are no private schools. Like literally, it's illegal to have a private school in Finland. There's some ways that the funding structure could be different, but basically anything that's a school in Finland has to follow the exact public guidelines. And so it's an entirely nationalized. It's not just a public option like in the United States. It's a public monopoly on education. Or we could even talk about Sweden and say, look, Sweden. There is some private healthcare in Sweden, but the overwhelming majority of public healthcare in Sweden is publicly owned. In fact, what exists there goes well beyond what like Bernie and the squad talk about, which is public, which is a public monopoly on health insurance. In Sweden, most hospitals are publicly owned. The doctors are like municipal employees. So that's one thing. It's like, yeah, it's not all or nothing, right? It's not that like either these places have achieved, the dream of buskers, Springsteenism or whatever we're going to call that now that Springsteen sucks. But or else there's nothing here that socialists can reasonably point to as a positive model for some of what we want. But also, like, there's a weird assumption, like he's doing like what Thomas Friedman, for example, does. Friedman, I remember, I wrote about this for Art Digital Media. He has he's got an article called from like a last year that's called something like, Joe Biden. Oh no, here we go. Joe Biden, not Bernie Sanders, is the true Scandinavian. And in the article, Friedman is doing the same thing same stuff that Munger is doing here, where he says, "Oh, but look, the Prime Minister of Norway says this, or these different politicians in different Scandinavian countries say this." It's like, guys, Nordic countries are not hive minds. These are complex societies that are divided into contending social classes and ideologies and political parties, like every other country in the world. And So yeah, if you talk to a socialist politician in one of those countries, they will play up the fact that these expansive welfare states were achieved by the efforts of the socialist movement, in collaboration with organized labor, and are, even if they're only a partial flowering, are flowering of that, of the politics. But if you talk to some center-right politician, like Friedman or Munger talk to, they will say, no, it's nothing at all socialist about any of this. What do you expect? I mean, yeah, it's like, and also just the one thing I want to say before going to Cale is that they always, another thing that these guys always do when they talk about Scandinavian countries, this falls more into the other strategy that Rob identified, the strategy where you say, yeah, they are socialist and that sucks. Right, it's socialist and that's bad, is that they attribute any sort of victory by the right in these countries, not as a political decision, like, oh, this is a policy decision because this political faction that wanted it came to power, but as something that was just this sort of apolitical technocratic thing that had to happen because socialism doesn't work. So if they, if there were some market reforms in Sweden, or there are certain things that had been decommodified and they privatized them again, that must mean that the public ownership was a disaster, and that's the only reason it happened, which is funny because they never seem to apply the same logic in the other direction and say, oh, the fact that this thing was nationalized in the first place shows that that it's being provisioned privately must have been a disaster.
Right. Yeah. No, I have a couple points I wanted to make, and that's one of them. And I might just say one more thing about that. But first, of course, the pig contest. I mean, just that's top-notch political scientists right there. I don't know. I mean, I think, like, to build on Rob's point about prices, I think Rob's right, but it's like, I think it's worth saying for those who have never spent any time thinking about this, like, this is a real issue that the left has had to try to figure out, and like we've had like trouble actually coming up with realistic answers on this for the calculation debate of the question of, like, can you in fact adequately price? Can, like, a central planning board, can the state say, there are not a bunch of people competing, and through the process of competition, you reach a natural price in a market? Can you in fact just set prices and not kind of clog up the system, down the line with all these different production processes? This, of course, became a massive issue for the Soviet states, especially in the context of having to compete globally, of being a socialist country or a communist country rather, within a capitalist world. This was a problem. This is where Vivek immediately starts off his argument by saying, like, yeah, we're not advocating for central planning. Central planning being everything is planned by a planning board. What he's advocating is that aspects of the economy, things like healthcare, education, housing, should in fact be planned. And he's advocating that for two reasons. One, because we don't think there's part of it's kind of a commitment to social justice, of saying that people in fact deserve these things in life. But we also know that we can successfully plan these parts of the economy, that, like, these are things that we've in fact tested out, whether it be in the Soviet countries or even more importantly in capitalist countries, in social democratic, capitalist, but social democratic countries in Northern Europe and elsewhere. And we in fact know that we can successfully plan these within a capitalist economy, and things don't fall apart. In fact, when you look at health outcomes the ratio of health outcomes to social spending, how much it costs to have a healthcare system. Obviously, if you're watching this, you already know, but like all of the Nordic countries, all of the countries that have some form of universal healthcare are paying way less than the US and have far greater health outcomes, despite having, universal healthcare systems with like holes punched into them from, capitalists coming in saying, I want to cleave out a little bit here and there and make some money off of it. That's what's happening with like the NHS and the internal markets. That's like, there's nothing natural about that. Like, that was a class war that capitalists ended up winning out through the Blair years of, we're going to punch holes into the system. It still works better than our system. But I mean, I think probably the best, most robust, but like accessible introduction to the socialist calculation debate is in Lee Phillips and Mikhail Rosworski's book, The People's Republic of Weimar. And you should, if you're serious about politics, you should read that, like, just to be familiar with like what is at stake in this. And then when Ben was talking about this, it's very strange that Munger is praising social democracy, especially in Sweden, which I will say, Rob, I think Sweden is the MVP. But anyways, I mean, like, the thing is, like, Chibber has laid out immediately, like, not like the first thing he says when he defines socialism is not, this is what socialism exactly looks like. He's not describing a blueprint. Actually, this is something that Rob's colleague and boss, Nathan Robinson, has a really great article from a bunch of years ago that I still keep coming back to, where it's like socialism is not like writing a book where, you kind of have, or no, sorry, it's not the equivalent. No, it is like writing a book. It's not like just having like a full blueprint where, where everything is going to be exactly from the get-go. It is something more like writing a book where you have a plan in mind and you might not end up at the exact final page that you thought you were going to, but there is kind of a coherent arc in the direction. And that's where I think, like, Chibber's saying, Chibber up front saying, socialism is a series of principles and a set of institutions that actualize those principles. And then we could say, is Swedish social democracy socialism? Well, probably not, but it's way more socialistic. It embodies far greater socialist principles than American neoliberalism today. So, it's not so much check boxes. It's not a fully formed blueprint. It's more of, these are the criteria by which we judge political questions as political thinkers and organizers. And then to kind of put maybe an exclamation point on Ben's last point about the fact that he's describing social democracy. He's describing Sweden in very static terms, like Ben saying that, social democracy, I'm down for it. It's not quite, it's not my ideal society, fine, but it's way better than what we got. But and Munger and I are agreeing on this, but Munger is completely disregarding how, in fact, social democracy came about, which we have really good empirical evidence. Like, this is not just like going off of like an intuition or something, but work by Dietrich Ruskmeyer, Evelyn Huber, John Stevens, and then separate, they have a book called Capitalist Development and Democracy, and then separate work by Adana Usmani. Here, I'll send you the piece, Rob. I see you writing. Adana Usmani has separate work on this as well that I believe at one point is going to turn into a book. But like, it's empirical research, and it's saying there is no such thing as bourgeois democracy. Sorry, Marxist-Leninists or whoever. It's like the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, whatever you want to call them, the ruling class, have never, ever historically been in favor of expanding democracy to working people. There is not a single incident of that in history. I mean, there's unfortunate phrasing that like kind of is easily brought up of like, bourgeois democracy describing what democracy looks like within capitalism. Fine. But like, it was not, in fact, something that was created by the ruling class for the workers or something. Anywhere and everywhere, working class people fought for the right to vote. They fought for greater expansion of political rights, of social rights. We have fought for the expansion of democracy within the workplace. And so when Munger says, he actually, I'm again preempting something, but basically from his presentation, he's saying, we don't need socialism, we need democracy. Fine, if that's, I don't agree with that, but like, you have to then admit that democracy, meaning that you want democracy, means effectively, if you want the expansion of democracy, it's going to mean by working class people for working class people into greater spheres of their life, because that's always what it's been. There has not been a democracy that was not carried forth by someone other than working class people. So yeah, you should. And again, if you want the number, like there's like people who have done research. Like it's not like I'm just making. You can actually look at the history of how democracy came about globally.
And yeah, kind of parallel to what Cale was saying about how like the social democracy that he's recognizing is very popular and even acknowledging that it has a lot of favorable features compared to where we're at now. Like you said, that's, further towards socialism at least than where we are now. Should recognize like the features of today that make people so unhappy. Like Vivek said, the decoupling of productivity and pay. I mean, that infuriates people when they learn about it. And all the other ugly features that we have now, like he said, desperation because of how twisted the economy is. All this stuff is because we took libertarian-y political steps, from getting rid of welfare to deregulating the banks to every other damn thing we've done since the Reagan Revolution. So he's kind of a weird character because he's sort of like opening up doors that I feel like any competent socialist could stroll through and beat his argument through. So it's kind of interesting. Maybe just one other thing I would say about this guy before we get back into the debate was I will say this, kind of a change in the angle here slightly. Like he is good on stage, like he came out and he did a joke and it was a self-deprecating joke. He implied that Vivek was smarter in a playful manner. And then, the hogs, like Cale was saying, like his folksy barnyard analogy bullshit. This is very Southern politics, obviously. You can kind of hear that in that voice. But this is charming shit. And people who, are enjoying these series where we look at how to debate well, like remember, like it is, like you can think it's dumb if you want to, but like having some charm really, really is important when you're doing these, especially if you're arguing the nominally less popular viewpoint, like we should socialize parts of the economy. Nothing to sneeze at. So, this guy, his arguments are sort of incoherent, but he has like that charm, and just looking at him there, he's kind of an underappreciated, Philip Seymour Hoffman character here. So we have to respect that.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say, I would put the point that Cale made slightly differently, right? Since by preference, I am much more blueprinty than Nathan is. Literally the book that Bhaskar and Mike Beggs and I have a contract for Verso to write is currently entitled The Blueprint. But I think without getting too blueprinty, like there is a way of I think making the same basic point that Cale just made without without,
and still sell the book.
And still sell the book, right? Like that's, come on guys, gotta eat. But the scotch doesn't buy itself. But there's a way to make the basic point that Cale just made while holding on to the idea that there's a fairly sharp line between capitalism and socialism, at least conceptually, which is this. Say, look, socialism would be a society in which workers no longer have to sell their labor power to capitalists, in the way that, in order to survive, in order to have a decent living, whatever. And is Sweden or Finland or Norway that? No, it's not. But it is a society where the working class, through labor unions, through socialist political parties, through class struggle, has achieved, has like extracted some very real concessions from capitalists, and has taken certain parts of society outside of the control of capitalists. That it's taken healthcare in several of these countries, all education, at least primary and secondary in Finland, etc. Banking to a limited extent, even because some of these places have social, postal banking. Has taken some important parts of society outside of the control of capitalists, and gotten capitalists to agree to things that they wouldn't agree to otherwise. Like sectoral bargaining, which is not perfect. I saw somebody point out in the chat there are definitely people who fall through the cracks of that, and aren't, their wages aren't determined by it. But these are huge concessions that make a massive difference to the quality of life of people in these countries, right? So, I mean, like, I'd say that, if socialism means that there's no society is no longer divided between workers and capitalists, sure, that hasn't been achieved. But, like, workers have, through those unions, through those socialist political parties, achieved really important things that have gotten them much closer along the road to getting rid of capitalism, even if capitalism still exists. Also, piggybacking on Cale's point about democracy, there's an article called "Disorganized Democracy" by Chris Massano. You could read; came out pretty recently in Jacobin that covers some of these points. But
it's just a good overview article. It's worth kind of introducing yourself.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a way of connecting this to what Munger said about China, because if you look at what happened, like the Occupy protests in Hong Kong a few years ago, those protesters in Hong Kong, a lot of what they were objecting to were things that were originally set by the British Empire. Let's not let them off the hook. They're the ones who originally instituted all this shit, but have been maintained by the Chinese authorities since they got Hong Kong back in the late 90s, because it serves their interests too, where basically you don't really have a universal franchise and everybody and the representatives that run the place in any sense, being democratically elected by the electorate as a whole. You got a little bit of that in some ways, but you also have like weird shit, like literally companies, can appoint representatives, to governing institutions directly, and the chief executive officer of Hong Kong, that's what they call him, that's literally what they call him, said during those protests, look, we could give everybody the vote, right, and have all of these positions be up for election, but 50% or whatever he said of Hong Kong is below the poverty line. What kind of politics do you think that would lead to? Like that was a quote, from the CEO of Hong Kong, appointed by China. So, like, that's like an unusually honest rendition of that point for something that happened within the last several years. But like, that's a level of honesty that used to be very common. If you go back and look at political debates from the 19th century, you'll see defenders of capitalism saying things like that all the time. Like, obviously, we can't let these crazy Chartists, give every single adult male in Britain, the vote for the House of Commons, or else we'll lose all our property. They'll take it all away. Like that used to be very, very common to be exactly that honest about it. And I think even today, a lot of libertarians are honest in very similar ways. And finally, I know that this, like, getting into the Danilism question could be a rabbit hole that could get.
Wait, but before you say that, because I don't think we're going to do the actual Q&A in this, because honestly, it's not a very good Q&A, but there is a libertarian that gets up and is mad at Munger because he's claiming that he's defending democracy too much, that he's like, actually, libertarianism should be against democracy.
Yeah, I wonder if that was Jason Brennan, because I know they mentioned he was here at the beginning. Jason Brennan is one of the many gifts that my academic field has given the world. He's a analytic philosopher and a right-wing libertarian who actually I think has a book called Against Democracy. There you go. But just to touch really briefly on it, because he did do the thing that people often do in these debates and say, oh, you want to know how awesome capitalism is? You want to know why our pig isn't quite as ugly as your pig? Well, look at China. It's the sort of opposite of the traditional right-wing rhetorical move, which is, oh, you want socialism? Look at Russia. Do you want that? It was sort of playing up how awful Russia was to discredit socialism. In this case, it's playing up how great China is to discredit socialism by saying, since China has become more capitalist, look at all these amazing things it's achieved. It's a super common conservative and libertarian argument. But it's a weird argument the more you think about it, because China is no one's idea of a libertarian utopia, to put it like mildly. And I don't just mean in terms of the political authoritarianism. I mean economically, it's no one's idea of a libertarian utopia. There is a large and thriving private sector, that's true, but like the state has a way bigger role in the Chinese economy than any normal capitalist country. And just saying, well, it's because, okay, they would be doing even better if they were even more capitalist. One, it's kind of a heads I win, tails you lose sort of argument. You just explain away anything. It's like saying, oh, the beauty and amazingness of the world shows that it was created by a loving God. Yeah, okay, all the parts of the world that don't fit that are because of original sin, right? It's like all of the good things about China are because of capitalism. All the bad things about China are because it's not quite capitalist enough. But in the real world, you can compare China to other countries that have had a somewhat similar developmental path, where the state has played a smaller role in sort of shepherding and planning economic development at the highest levels. And China is by far the gold medalist in terms of rapid economic development, which like the Steven Pinker stuff that, look at how much poverty has decreased, which is some of what Munger is implicitly leaning on here, which, by the way, a lot of that's bullshit. There was a great TMBS segment years ago called Pinker Caught Being a Stinker about poverty stats. Basically what he's talking, when Pinker talks about people being lifted out of poverty, he means people who are, and I assume Munger is probably relying on the same stats here, he means people who are being paid more than $2 a day. That's the cutoff for not being in poverty, according to this.
Yeah, the hilariously low poverty line. Yeah, that's one of the classic, satisfy the masses treats. You guys got 3 crumbs instead of 2 today. What are all these complaints? I would say just real fast, just like Munger's attributing China's success to proving how great capitalism is. We should just remember, because the right's been doing this since the 80s. Before it was Japan and Korea and Taiwan that showed how great capitalism is, and they freed up the magic of the market, Reagan said, and everything went great. But just like China, they have this gigantic state role in the economy that takes incredibly elaborated form, not just subsidies and preferential tax treatment, but public state investments to shape the way the industry evolves, and picking winners and losers, at least as far as sectors go. That's why Samsung exists in Korea, is for those kind of reasons. Sony in Japan, So this has been going on for a long time. These guys have just noticed, China has money now, so they must have been capitalist logically, because now they have more dollars. Just to mention, this stupid hustle's been going on since we were little kids. I just wanted to throw that in there.
No, absolutely, and yeah, even South Korea. Certainly it played an important role as a stronghold for American empire in the Cold War as an anti-communist state, but also South Korea was able to develop as well as they did by doing crazy amounts of protectionism.
I wanted to Ben.
So just before you go, Cale, just real quickly wrap up the point. The point I'm making here is not China is a great model. China has dystopian levels of economic inequality and poverty, both of which, contra Munger, are actually important in their own ways. And they're certainly extremely authoritarian politically, and they crack down on anybody who tries to organize meaningful independent trade unions. So China is absolutely not my preferred model, but it's I think if you're being honest about this, right, that global decline in poverty, that you have to measure poverty as $2 a day, even the World Bank and the IMF will tell you that $5 a day, which is still hilariously low, but they'll say that that's a better indication of poverty than $2 a day. If you say $5 a day, then you actually don't get the decline in poverty they talk about. Even at $2 a day, you get a decline in the percentage of poverty. You don't get a decline in the raw number of poor people. But even putting all that aside, the vast bulk, right, the greatest concentration of this poverty reduction is in one country, China, which is a success story not for the kind of laissez-faire system that people like this typically advocate, although this guy's kind of confused and about Sweden as we established. It's a success story for a modified form of state socialism that, and, a sort of weird combination of that and capitalism that, like just following the data where it leads seems to be a much better development model, not just than what they had in China under Mao, but also a much better development model than anything that's more capitalist than it, which is the only point I wanted to make. Cale?
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, Deng is leaps and bounds over Mao. And by the way, I've recently learned it's not Deng, it's Deng, and that's kind of disappointing because you can't say Dengism. You're supposed to say Dengism, but you want to say Dengism. I don't know. We're just culturally insensitive.
I think I'll go on just getting it wrong. I think that's fine. I'll just continue being wrong.
Ben, can you switch the share screen for a second to go to mine? Okay, so this is from Isabella Weber's new book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy. It's an economics book, so if you're not familiar, it's maybe a little hard to get into, but I'm not an economics person. I don't have a degree in it, and I'm able to read this book, and it's great. So, but immediately up front, she has these two graphs that I think tell the whole story, which is that going from the 80s into the 90s, basically the collapse of the USSR, the collapse of Maoist China. The collapse of Maoist China happens earlier than the collapse of the USSR. But the point is that you can just look at these two graphs that compare USSR inflation and or just like Russian inflation and Russian GDP with Chinese inflation and Chinese GDP. And the Russian situation is GDP even falling in the 90s and barely recovering. It's basically flatlined, and inflation has gone through the roof, which, not to explain inflation right now, but it's bad. You don't want it. Whereas in China, GDP, it's a little rocky. It's going up. It's a little rocky, but oh my freaking God, it's like skyrockets to like levels that we have never seen in human history. And inflation has remained low. And the difference between these two countries that Weber, points to, and I think she's completely right about this, is the fact that in Russia, the transition period, the way they went from a centralized planned economy, everything in the economy is planned, to what it is today is just full total market liberalization, basically just like, hardcore laissez-faire neoliberal capitalism, all of it all at once. And when you do that, you get this. And in China, when you convert by basically saying aspects of your economy are going to be liberalized, but the commanding heights of the economy are going to remain planned, you get this. So I'm not saying we should be China. That's not my argument. I'm just saying, like, there's certain principles at work here that are pretty obvious, that when you go full market liberalization, it doesn't necessarily mean prosperity. In fact, you can get this outcome, which is really, really bad.
It's really, really bad, and I think that like it's bad in ways that you might not get just from looking at that, right? I mean, as bad as that is on its face, like I think most Americans have very little idea of what a post-apocalyptic movie Russia in the 90s was. I mean, this is really like, this is the stuff that's like the most sort of lurid fantasy that the craziest right-winger could have about like the United States collapsing and what that would mean. All of that stuff really happened in Russia and elsewhere in the former Soviet Union. They had, like civil wars, massive decrease in life expectancy, massive, increase in alcoholism, which was already a serious social problem, like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, like, it was just like that society was just destroyed by that total market liberalization that happened at that time. Whereas, yeah, China, like, saying, all right, I mean, I think you have to make a distinction. Like, there are two times I did a debate about China with Conrad Hamilton on the Surf's YouTube channel. I don't know, very early 2020, maybe, I don't really remember. And, I made all of the obvious points about why, as somebody who wants socialist democracy, I don't like the Chinese model. But I also had another discussion with him later, like, I don't know, several months later, where we sort of put aside debating like whether we should think that model is a good thing or a bad thing, and just sort of did, okay, what are the positive lessons that can be learned from it? And I think a lot, because I think it is actually really useful information that you can have state ownership, the commanding the kites of the economy, combined with markets existing, at lower levels, and that can be a smashing economic success, right? That's super useful information. Now, I would like to combine that with economic egalitarianism and political democracy, rather than having a billionaire class like you have in China and crushing labor unions and all that stuff. But despite that, I mean, I think you can separate the questions. I mean, like, and say, well, I mean, this is what Lee and Michael do in the People's Republic of Walmart. When they're talking about Walmart, right? Obviously, they don't like Walmart as a model. Say, oh yeah, well, the internal organization of Walmart is how society should be, but they're still using the successes of Walmart to try to draw logistical lessons about whether you actually do need markets for everything. That Walmart has. Walmart has no internal markets, right? It's a completely, planned economy internally. Sears actually did try to introduce internal markets, and it was a catastrophe. And that's useful. That's useful information. So, in any case, I do want to. We should probably. So, if you have a last point, Cale, then
let's get to the last bits of the debate.
Yeah, go to the last part of the debate.
You might have to share your screen again. So this is going to be Chibber's responding, then there'll be another response, and then it'll be a little bit of a back and forth. And again, we're not doing the Q&A because it's bad, but you can look it up on YouTube.
Of the debate, so each of our speakers will have 5 minutes to address what the other person says. 5 minutes, and after
all
that,
right. I also just explained this, sir. You don't have to.
I am smarter, and it's true, I won't wear a tie. I am blown away that my libertarian colleague is now advocating for Swedish-style social democracy. If that's what the right wants to push for in this country, sign me up. I'm all for it. This is where we've come. The political culture in the last 10 years, fantastic, Mike. I think we agree on most everything, it turns out. Let me make a couple of points here, which I do feel that are important. Mike says the main problem with markets is manipulation of prices, that prices, if left to their own, rationally allocate resources in society, and they are, in fact, able to bring about a division of labor, which in the Smithian sense, like an invisible hand, maps the production of goods onto what people's needs are. This is distorted when there's a manipulation of prices. Well, that's not really true. It's also the case that a functioning price system leads to perverse incentives. And as welfare economists realized as early as the 1950s and later, there can be a massive difference between private profits, private benefits, or rather private returns and social returns. A very good example. In this country, over the last 10 years, there has been a series of givebacks to corporations. Donald Trump's tax breaks, most recently, are a great example. The very easy monetary policy, the changing of investment laws on the assumption that when corporations are given full freedom of their investment activities, what they will do is take these funds to the most the highest returns, and that will have enormous social returns, et cetera, et cetera. What has happened over the past 10 years? The rate of return in American industry has gone up massively. The rate of profit has gone up massively. The rate of investment has remained just about flat. They got an enormous ocean of money coming to them, and on a rational calculation of prices, what did they do? Well, most of that money, we know how much now, about 94% went into what? Corporate buybacks of their own shares. What does that mean? It's a fancy word for saying they lined their pockets. Okay, this is an example of a rational economic choice made for what markets are supposed to do, increasing private returns, which have had very low social returns. A classic example of a situation in which the market is failing on the very issues on which it's supposed to succeed. So that's one of the rationales for saying that there's got to be a much closer supervision of this stuff, and in some cases, taking out some of these decisions from the market altogether. It is not the case, as Mike says, that the alternative to an autonomous market functioning is bureaucrats setting prices. Sweden, I'm going to keep coming back to Sweden because he opened the door. In Sweden, a huge panoply of goods, their prices were decided not by bureaucrats, but through bargaining, starting in the labor market. Swedish prices of wages, of a whole host of consumer goods, of pensions, of housing, were decided through strong, centralized collective bargaining, tripartite boards between an organized labor movement and employers, which is what the market is supposed to have. The problem is, in an unregulated, non-unionized markets, one party gets to set all the prices. That's the essence of what capitalism is. Mike says, well, what you really care about is eradicating poverty, but if you want to eradicate poverty, it's going to come at a choice, at a cost, which is you're going to have inequality. Chinese example, if you ask the Chinese 400 million or so, you said 500, I think you meant 500 million. The 500 million who have been raised out of poverty, do they care about inequality? They would say, no, that's not true. They would say, yes, but we can't have both, is what they would say. Mike says, yeah, it's true, you can't have both. Again, false. In his favorite country of Sweden, for 60 years, you did both. You decreased poverty and you had the most solidaristic wages, the highest compression of inequality in the capitalist world. And he's right, it is capitalist, but it is a capitalism of a certain sort. You can have both. But it requires moving away from the unfettered markets that Mike is advocating for. Lastly, he says capitalism saved Sweden. It's moved to all these new marketized things. Yeah, in the past 12 years it has. But keep one thing in mind. It's moved to them less than the rest of Western Europe, less than Germany, less than England, less than France. Why? Simple reason. It still has 70% union density. There is still an organized working class in Sweden that has prevented a full-scale privatization of all the things that we've seen in England and in Germany go down. If the decrease in union density continues apace, you will see Sweden moving further in those directions. And mind you, I was just there a year and a half ago giving a series of talks. It's pretty clear in the labor movement that the move to the voucher system in schools, the privatization of the pension funds, the emergence of a dual labor market, the precarization of work, that is what's behind the rise of the far right in Sweden. It is because the working people in Sweden feel that they've been let down by the Social Democratic Party and by the mainstream parties, all of whom are saying to the Swedish working class now, there's nothing we can do. It's the market, baby. Love it or go to what? Denmark or something. The only people who come to them and say, no, you deserve a job. You deserve to be protected from what the market can do. Right now is the far right. So there's a cost that's coming, even for Sweden, to embracing all of these market reforms, which is the collapse of the Social Democratic Party, which in the last elections had the lowest showing in 70 years. It's because its voter base now feels they've abandoned us. So yeah, there is still a better alternative to the US, which is Sweden right now. But a better alternative to the Sweden of now is Sweden of 1970.
We should hear his response, and then.
So I just wanted to make 2 points before that. One, because I just forgot to say, one that occurred to me just now, and one that I forgot to make earlier. One that occurred to me just now is we've only actually been talking about half of what they've been debating. So the two questions they've been debating are whether we should have capitalism or socialism, and whether or not you should wear neckties. And on the tie question, I think on the capitalism socialism question, Vivek is solid. I mean, I think he's been making really good arguments. On the tie question, I'm going to have to go third camp because Vivek's position apparently is button-down shirt, no tie, no jacket, and Munger's position is button-down shirt, tie, jacket. And I've got to say that this is just a place where you need a third way, and what you need is a t-shirt, sports jacket.
Specifically, Bernie t-shirt, sports jacket.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Oh, yeah. You've been a part of that for a little while, Ben. I remember when you did that debate at the Villages in Florida, and you had like this very nice like blazer, and I think a T-shirt that said "fuck ICE" on it or something like that. So you definitely you've been on that corner.
Ben was up debating it like Beavis and Butthead, like work sucks.
Yeah, that's the correct option. Also, did just want to say, that. When Munger, like along with his praising Swedish social democracy, but then saying that actually it was kind of a disaster and they had to do these market reforms, but I guess praising like what's left of Swedish social democracy after those market reforms, when he was going back and forth about what he thought about democracy during his anti-democratic phase, when he said that all the problems with consumers are multiplied, with voters, right? That all the problem with ordinary people in their capacity as consumers are going to be worse when they're exercising their capacity as voters. His example was, people who can't even decide, was it whether Coke is better than Pepsi, going to get together and decide foreign policy. And all I could think, I forgot to say this earlier, is, my God, in the real world, yeah. When the United States first invaded Afghanistan, for example, it had this crazy 90% approval rating because, elites did a very good job of catastrophizing, the consequences of not doing it and getting ordinary people behind them. But ordinary people were disillusioned with that war long before political elites were. Like if you look at the opinion polls, if ordinary people actually did get together to decide foreign policy, we would have pulled out of Afghanistan like 15 years ago, not like right now.
Yeah.
And the same goes if you look at polling on Israel-Palestine. Most Americans want the United States to at least be a much more neutral arbiter there, et cetera, et cetera. John Romer, in his book "A Future for Socialism," talks about polls before the first Iraq War, the Gulf War, where majority of the public wanted to give negotiations a chance and not go straight to war. In context, the point he's making is that even though everybody would have benefited from lower oil prices, which was going to be the result of it, since most people had very limited stake in it, they didn't have the incentive, to support belligerents, that people had, they had much more at stake in it. But I think all of the empirical evidence shows that if ordinary people were able to decide foreign policy, the results would be way better than they are right now, where essentially ordinary people have no input into it whatsoever. Anyway.
Yeah, hot take. I think most working class people are both good and fairly rational. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Be cool if more people thought that too.
Well, obviously, my claim is going to be the reason that the Sweden of 1970 doesn't work is that the people in Sweden thought that didn't work, and that's why they went in the direction of capitalism. Let me say there's something we may just disagree about that's more fundamental. The kind of regulation that protects large corporations is not a failure of capitalism. It is a failure of American democracy. I recently wrote a paper called The Road to Cronyism. That's after Hayek's Road to Serfdom, in which I said capitalism may not be sustainable in a two-party democracy. And the difficulty that we have is that most of our political leaders of both parties are simply bought and paid for. by those large corporations. As I wrote in the Georgetown Law Review, I asked the question, is too big to fail too big? Well, yes, it is. So if we look at the companies that should have been broken up to save capitalism on Wall Street, what we did instead was use taxpayer money to bail them out. The very firms that had stolen consumer money through what was effectively a Ponzi scheme in the housing market had money taken from taxpayers and given to them because our democratic system is not capable of making a commitment not to do that. Now, I think organized labor is part of the answer. Donald Trump won a majority of union voters in 2016. Donald Trump won a majority of white women in 2016. The abandonment of labor by the Democrats is catastrophic, but it's not going to come back because neither party seems to be interested in organized labor in the United States. Who received the largest amount of corporate and Wall Street contributions in 2009 in the US House? The answer is Barney Frank. Barney Frank received by far the largest amount of contributions, and then he wrote the Dodd-Frank regulation, which benefited the large financial corporations by creating entry barriers that made it impossible for new firms to enter. So Barney Frank's legislation was bought and paid for by those large corporations because our democratic system is not capable of turning those things away. You can't blame a dog for eating out of the garbage, but you can't go putting the garbage outside like that. We have a failure of democracy. My own view is that we need to do three things. First, raise taxes. Why would we raise taxes? Well,
Not
the
really
answer is we
following
have
that metaphor.
gigantic deficits, and I think that US policy is daft, D-A-F-T. Deficits are future taxes.
Then are you familiar with how dogs work?
Intergenerational transfer of wealth that the United States has ever seen, where people who are not yet old enough to vote and probably haven't even been born are paying for my health care. And I'm really rich. Why in the world don't I pay for my own? Or why don't, through taxes? And I don't mean necessarily through private market systems, but why not through taxes? So the first thing is to raise taxes to try to balance the budget. Neither party is concerned about this. We need to invest in education and infrastructure instead of just using the money that we have to pay for current consumption. And third, we need to adopt some kind of basic income and single payer healthcare. And the reason is that those are better and those are more libertarian than the current things that we have in place. If you look at Obamacare, the opposition to Obamacare should have come from the left, having the large insurance companies dominate this. Is that a failure of capitalism? You can't blame dogs for eating out of the garbage. Our democratic system is not capable of withstanding, of acting, of actually carrying out the functions that a state needs to do. We need to embrace democracy. We don't need to worry about embracing socialism. The problem is not with our economic system. The problem is with our political system. Thank you.
All right, at this point in the evening, we're going to have a short moderated conversation before we open things up to general Q&A. Just to look respectful.
He's getting dumber.
So I think you two do agree on a lot, perhaps a surprising amount for many people in the audience. But rather than kind of support the love fest that's developing here, I'm going to poke at the areas of disagreement, which I think are real between the two of you. So one question I'll direct to you, Mike, has to do with the nature of productivity in the U.S. economy over the 20th century and early 21st century. So Professor Chibber made the argument that a lot of that productivity had gone to benefit the already wealthy. That CEO pay had increased dramatically while worker pay had remained relatively stagnant. So yes, the economy as a whole is getting richer, but the way in which that wealth has been distributed has been A, very unequal, and B, not to much benefit to the working class. First of all, is that an accurate characterization of what you said? How would you respond to those arguments?
Well, he was careful to say wages, and that's right. If you look at total compensation, the difference is much smaller. What is the most expensive thing to working people? And the answer is healthcare. The cost of their healthcare increases by 10, sometimes 15% per year. Now, does that benefit them? No, they're no better off than they were in 1970. So that part of the story is right. But the idea that all of the difference in productivity gains is going to capital is just empirically false. What's happened is that our healthcare system is dysfunctional. The United States spends 18 or 19% of its GDP on healthcare, and that's in a system where 30% don't even have coverage. How can that possibly be when we look at the countries of Northern Europe and see universal healthcare with 9 or 10% of GDP? So the answer is our healthcare system has created, it's supposed to be nonprofit. It's nonprofit in the sense that it's not equity finance, but the amount of money that is being poured into our healthcare system, much of the money that working people don't have went in the direction of healthcare. If you look at the costs to firms and the cost to workers of healthcare, that's where an awful lot of their total compensation now goes. Now, that's of no benefit to workers, I agree, but it's a different story about the power of capital. What we see instead is the power of the healthcare industry as a lobbyist that managed to get through, as I said before, Obamacare. So if you look at total compensation, that alligator's mouth is only open a little bit. It's not that huge, voracious thing into which all the productivity gains have gone.
Professor Chibber, did you want to respond to that?
No matter how you measure it, the fact of the matter is, if you look at the work that's coming out from Piketty and Saez and their colleagues, if you just look at income, there's no way around the fact that the vast bulk of the income gains of the past 40 years have gone to the top 1%. And the top 1% is the holders of capital. I take your point that if you bring in healthcare, that modifies the story. But here's the question for us as a normative question is this: whatever the details of that distribution have to be, A, are they a natural consequence of the functionings of the market? And B, are they just? Are they in any way morally justifiable? I think the answer is no. That's an absurd thing to bring up, to be honest with you. In a discussion about the structure of the American economy, you're going to talk about the handful of people who make big money out of sports. It is a favorite example of libertarians, and it does violence to the reality that 100 million people face in this country every day.
Yeah, sorry, if you didn't hear that, there was like a heckler basically that was saying, yeah, but what about like professional athletes? How do they fit into this?
Okay, yeah, I was wondering if that was a heckler, if we'd slipped into Q&A, but
No.
I guess we've got a few more minutes until actual Q&A, so let's plunge through and then wrap up.
Yeah.
Not just yet. We will be taking questions in a moment. And actually, I've got a microphone set up in the back.
Can I say one thing?
Yes.
Virtually everything Mike said in his rebuttal, I really agreed with. My question to Mike would be, and I don't know if this is the time to do that.
Please, yeah.
Mike says correctly, I think, that there's a failure of democracy because of the way in which these politicians have been bought off by the wealthy, by the corporation. Barney Frank's a great example of this. And the flaws of Obamacare is a great example. And much of the left was, in fact, criticizing Obamacare for the reasons you say. You're right, it's a very authoritarian program. My only worry is this, Mike, which is, how can you not agree that it is an endogenous consequence of the massive inequalities in wealth and income that is going to show up in that money being used to buy politicians? The whole essence of the left argument is that democracy starts to fail when you have these enormous concentrations of money in the economic sphere. They use that to then exert influence in the political sphere. So in principle, I totally agree with you that what we need to do is save democracy as a way of having a more rational regulation of the healthcare system, of infrastructure, et cetera, but without either an enormous decrease in the inequality of wealth and without a counterweight to the power of the wealthy, which is labor and organized labor. I don't see how you can do that.
Both of us have our own secret unicorn in the closet. So your secret unicorn is getting that legislation through a system that's largely controlled by the existing two-party systems and powerful corporations. We're not going to be able to do that. I'm asking that existing elected members of Congress, I have to laugh even when I say it, it's ridiculous. Existing members of Congress are going to vote for a parliamentary system with proportional representation. That's no less ridiculous. Both of us have a ridiculous proposal, but both of us are also out here trying to talk to people to say, we need to rethink this in terms of solutions, and solutions that at first seem ridiculous might, with explanation, start to become more plausible.
One of the other areas in which I sense there probably is some significant disagreement between you has to do with your proposal to nationalize large segments of the American economy. If I understood you correctly in your comments, you granted the traditional critique of central planning, sort of Soviet-style grand-scale central planning. Why do you think the problems that beset central planning of the entire economy wouldn't also apply to central planning of large sectors of the economy? Or do you not envision it as central planning?
No, it's going to be planning, largely because those parts of the economy are basically planned anyway. And even the private sector companies that oversee them have to have a fairly long investment cycle and a fairly long projection of what the growth in demand, et cetera, is going to be. And in those sectors, the growth in demand, growth in utilization, the kind of capital requirements that it takes are much easier to predict than they are in more volatile consumer sectors. All the sections of the economy that I said need to be nationalized and need to be planned in some way have in the past been successfully planned and successfully nationalized in capitalist economies in the past. So we have a wealth of experience to draw on there.
Satisfied with that?
Yes.
Not what I expected you to say. Would you have a question before Professor Chibber before we turn things over to open question and answer?
No.
Okay, you're making this easy. Okay, so we have an open question.
There's one thing, and so the Q&A starts. I believe at one point as it starts going, Chibber does rebut Mike's claim that they both have unicorns in the closet, because Chibber says you actually genuinely do have a problem in your hands because you don't have an explanation for what you've just described. But I provided an explanation for what I said a moment ago when I gave my introductory presentation, which is that the left has a strategy for actually conquering and claiming power in society. And that's through the labor movement. That's through working class people organized basically because they are at the center of where profits are generated in society, because working class people are in the workplace that if they don't show up to work, then profits won't accumulate for the bosses. Because of that structural leverage, that if you're able to collectively organize it, working class people can effectively actually wield power in capitalism. They can, both within the workplace and also, as we've seen historically, through both workplace organizing and then through the development of working class and socialist political parties, using that argument as their weapon against the parties of capital. They can, in fact, make the reforms that Chibber's advocating for. So he makes this point later on, but it's not worth trying to find in the Q&A. But
right on. That's cool. That was an interesting piece there. I got to say, one thing that I kind of thought was going to happen a little bit sooner, maybe, was when Munger brought up the cronyism. You couldn't have it better. He wrote a paper, and he's very proud to tell us the road to cronyism. I'm almost too clever. I'm a rascal. Oh my God. The guy's about as funny as a urinary tract infection. Like, the thing is, of course, I've seen economists and conservatives and libertarians do this 100 times. They'll look, they recognize that people hate the current economy. They feel screwed over. They see huge monopolies and all powerful corporations, running the state, obviously. And they hate that stuff. So libertarians will say, oh, yeah, it's terrible how powerful big tech is. The big banks, oh, I hate them. It's because of really limited financial regulatory bills like Dodd-Frank, the most pitiful, wimpy little, Barney Frank. I'm glad that Barney Frank got dumped on by two people in this video. It's the beginning of a adequate amount of dumping on that guy. But his approach is like, if it wasn't for all these regulations, we wouldn't have all this cronyism and all these big, powerful companies because, like you said, Dodd-Frank keeps out new competitors. It protects the incumbents. Stupidest fucking read of the economics you could possibly have. I mean, what did we have in the 19th century? What did we have in the Gilded Age before all of this shit? Like back in the 1800s, there's no minimum wage, there's no industrial regulations, there's no labor laws, there's no environmental laws, unions don't exist. You can do anything you want. And what do we have? We have monopoly in industry after industry, from oil to banking. Like Morgan ran a banking. I mean, it was more of a cartel there rather than a straight monopoly. But if you look at the history of that industry, before we put any rules on them, like the real rules of the 30s that did break the banks up and stuck them within their home state, which is also really important, separated the insurance and the investment in commercial banking. Like those were real regulations from the 30s and the New Deal era. Like that shit worked pretty good. Put the banks in their place and kept us from having giant crises. But you don't want to look at that, because that suggests you can use progressive state policy to constrain these companies and maybe break them down so they're just kind of big. So we'll leave all of that shit out. Please don't bring up Rockefeller or Morgan or Frick. That is not favorable. We'll just say, if it wasn't for these rules, if it wasn't for these labor laws, you'd have 20 new steel companies opening every day, I imagine. And of course, the reality is we have economies of scale and network effects and every kind of real economic phenomenon that leads capitalism over time, sooner or later, to have these giant companies that run everything. And yeah, then obviously are in the position to have the money to rewrite state power. I just got to say, that cronyism thing is, every libertarian I think I've ever argued with brings that up. And we should realize the record shows it's the flimsiest fig leaf you could ever put in front of the weird misshapen genitals of capitalism. I yield the floor.
Yeah, I mean the cronyism thing, that actually really does require a magical unicorn to fix. And I mean, it's also true by and large, like when you talk about cronyism, a lot of what they're really talking about is not actually stuff that they're not really talking about the working class at all. I mean, like that's not even really the picture. What they're talking about is big capitalists, influencing regulations to guide them in a direction that makes it harder for smaller capitalists to compete with them, which is a real thing. I mean, that absolutely really does happen a lot. But I think it's an important thing, that distinction to keep track of, right? Because the idea that the problem with the majority of society is that it's harder for them than it needs to be to start their own businesses. Just fundamentally doesn't make sense. I mean, most people can't. I mean, if you have collective ownership of the means of production, that's one thing. Whether that takes place through private cooperatives or a democratic state or anything else. But if you're talking about like regular capitalist private ownership, most people just definitionally can't be business owners. I mean, if you have a complex society, it's one thing if you have like a society where most people are small farmers, producing, their own, sustenance. But if you have a advanced, developed society with a complex division of labor, most people can't own their own businesses. Like there's no way for a modern economy to function with everybody as their own little individual business owner. So that's like, so anytime you're talking about, like, if the focus is all about making it harder for ordinary people to compete with big capitalists, you're just completely taking your eye off the ball of the problem that the majority of the society actually has, which is not that there isn't a level enough playing field for them to own their own businesses, but the fact that they are that most people are workers, that they're under the thumb of a capitalist. Their problem is very different from the problems of somebody trying to compete with that capitalist. Their problem is that they're being dominated, by the capitalist in the workplace. But also, like the magical unicorn point Cale's talking about, like, okay, ignore everything I just said, and let's pretend that cronyism really is the heart of the problem with capitalism as it exists now. That's where you got that metaphor that briefly confused me about the leaving the trash out and the dogs eating it. It got very folksy there, even more so than the pigs in some ways. But it's also a weird metaphor because, like, yeah, you should train your dog to not do that, but like dogs can be trained. Like is the thing I've learned about dogs, that that it's not just that you have like dog behavior is set down by God at the beginning of time. Like dog training is a thing that exists, which makes it maybe not a great metaphor for capitalism. But like the reason that like saying, oh, the problem isn't the capitalists eating the trash. The problem is government leaving the trash out for them to eat. In other words, the problem is that capitalism is crony capitalism. The reason that really does require magical unicorn to solve is what Vivek was correctly pointing out at the very end there, that the idea that you can have massive wealth inequality, right, which is itself downstream from massive inequality and economic power, for the reasons he was talking about, in his opening statement, that if you get to decide how the surplus value that's produced, by workers is divided up, then somehow or another, every time you end up getting, the biggest slice. But if you have massive inequalities in wealth, you're going to get massive inequalities in political influence. The idea that there's some possible society where you have, the economic structure that we have right now, but also you don't have any, like capitalists don't have any more political influence than anybody else, which is what's implicit in all of his stuff about, the problem isn't capitalism, it's that we need to fix democracy. The problem is that we're leaving the trash out for the dogs to eat in the first place. Like that's just delusional. How's that going to happen? I mean, what's the scenario? He even talked about, like, he said his magical unicorn was switching to a parliamentary system, but guess what? The world is full of parliamentary systems that coexist with the same kind of economic structures that we've got in this country. Like there are tons of countries that have parliaments, and they have more than two political parties. But they have tons of cronyism, like they have wealthy elites that exercise massive amounts of political influence, and he's just saying, let's keep the wealthy elite, but let's not have them exercise any political influence. And that really seems like something that's much more appropriately been described by saying, let's continue to leave the trash uncovered every night and just hope the dog doesn't eat it.
Right. I mean, it's kind of unfortunate that up front in Vivek's opening presentation, when he gets to the question of elite capture of the political system, he actually just says, like, the evidence is like overwhelming at this point, and then moves on. Because I think he was expecting a different libertarian, is my sense. That like this, like, I think we can again all agree that Munger was a fairly unorthodox libertarian, although, like I've said before with Ben, it's hard to find two libertarians that are exactly the same. It's like kind of a weird mix of, it's like when you get jelly beans and you get all these different flavors, those are libertarians. But the other thing with like the dog and the trash metaphor that is kind of frustrating is that it ends up, because he's saying that this is like just their nature. This is what they are going to do. And he ends up naturalizing structural incentives to do or to not do something. And the thing that we've discovered is that, like, yes, there are in fact certain structural incentives built into capitalism, regardless of the kind of capitalism you have, whether it's like the most like horrific neoliberalism or post-war New Deal arrangement or Swedish social democracy. There are incentives that say that capitalists necessarily have to maximize profit and minimize costs. But we've also found over the course of the 20th century, like we've done a massive social experiment around the world, and we found actually you can have other kinds of incentives that can force capitalists to invest in certain ways or to not invest in certain ways, or that they have to make certain arrangements with their employees or with society broadly, with citizens, and you can't just bulldozer over everyone else for your narrow interests. And like that's a massive social innovation within capitalism. Like that's, we've simultaneously discovered that social democracy can make these massive leaps and bounds within capitalism, and that it's fundamentally a dynamic and unstable arrangement whereby the other incentives built into capitalism that I mentioned before of maximizing profit and minimizing costs don't go away. But like it's nothing to sneeze at that. Like we have in fact found other ways to add incentives and disincentives, structural disincentives and incentives to capitalists. And the question is ultimately to what extent can we craft the structural incentives for capitalists such that their interests don't end up coming at the decimation of like the planet and everyone living on it. And that's like, again, I'm very partisan to Chibber's definition of socialism and to the Burgess amendments put on the floor earlier tonight. I think that probably will end up solving that situation. But like Boskar's opening chapter in the Socialist Manifesto, and I think he really eloquently describes it like as like a dynamic process of these are a series of decisions and votes and fights and conflicts that are occurring over a period of time. And I think, if social democracy is the best we can do, great. But we also have to realize like we have to fight for that and we have to defend that. And the natural interests of working class people in the course of fighting for that might end up tipping it into something that we call socialism. And that process is what we're geared towards. Wherever we end up, wherever we find is like the most plausible, utopia. Or what was Eric Olin-Wright's phrase?
Utopias?
Real utopias, yeah. Whatever the most real utopia is. Great, but that's just like that's the whole thing. And again, Michael Brooks used to say this, that like this is what the right always does, that they always will naturalize social dynamics and social structures and social incentives and disincentives. And it's our job to say, no, actually, this is something distinct. This is a social system, structure, incentive, whatever. And because it's social, it can be changed. It can't be transformed. And that the way that capitalism exists today is not the way capitalism has always existed, and certainly won't be the way it'll exist in the future if it still exists.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I do really like that point, Cale. I wouldn't have thought of it in exactly those terms, but that all of the folksy, dog and pig metaphors and everything do tend are exactly what Michael was talking about in Against the Web. The naturalizing or mythologizing, what should be historicized. Saying that these are systems and structures that emerged at a certain point in history and could potentially disappear at other points in history. In fact, some of them for sure will disappear. Whether they're replaced with anything better, or worse, is an open question. It has to be decided, in the course of struggle. But I mean, it's not just going to stay the same, for forever. I mean, that's not viable. So yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I do. I think that. Yeah, I mean, maybe just go back to the magical unicorn point and then throw to Rob that, they like, I don't know. I was trying to think of what a good example that, okay, rhinoceros, that really exists, right? It's not a magical unicorn. It's a real thing with one horn.
We're crunching the numbers and looking it up right now, Ben, but continue.
Okay. But the actual rhinoceros, the actual natural rhinoceros, not magical unicorn, that can bring about the kinds of changes Vivek is advocating in this debate, with or without my friendly amendments, is the power of workers, that most of society doesn't benefit from these arrangements for all the reasons Vivek was laying out in his opening statement. The majority of people are very poorly served by them, and the majority of people have an interest in changing them, and there are mechanisms that we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. We don't have to this is not a mystery. I mean, there are historical examples of these mechanisms being used by which that majority of society could alter those arrangements to be closer to their liking. That you can organize a union in your workplace and go on strike, until you get better wages. That you can elect a socialist political party. That you can have whatever, general strikes, riots. That you can do various things to exert pressure on the system, or even start to replace it with something else. And of course, the ideological obstacles to this, which are not even primarily in terms of not thinking that these changes would be desirable, but are primarily in terms of just believing in the possibility of collective action, to bring about change, are enormous. And that's why we have this show and Jacobin and Current Affairs and all that stuff, because we're trying to chip away at that ideological facade. But I mean, there is a historical agent, a rhinoceros, if you will, that has both the incentive and the ability to bring about the change that we want, which is the working class majority of society. And I saw somebody in the chat saying, this is a sort of pessimistic line I hear from leftists sometimes. Oh, well, you can only get social democracy because of Cold War competition with the Soviet Union, which, I think there's a germ of truth in it. Certainly the existence of capital C communism is a sort of pressure point that, we don't want this, we don't want various countries to go communist. We want to keep them, within the capitalist camp. Was an incentive to allow for certain kinds of reforms that doesn't exist anymore. That's true, but also I think it's kind of historically illiterate to say that that's the only way that you get that stuff, because for one thing, it makes it a total mystery how you got communism in the first place.
Right. I mean, I'm gonna be unnuanced right now and say that is not how the Nordic countries got social democracy. It's just maybe it was a factor, but it was certainly not the most important. It wasn't the second or third most important. And if you want to know the history, go read Esping Anderson or Corpy. There's histories of this. It's not a mystery. We in fact do know how the working classes of these countries organized. We know how the socialists and communists in these countries organized. We know the kinds of class alliances that were formed at certain key historical junctures. It's really freaking weird, but the Nordic working class ended up having to team up with the small holding peasant people of Northern Europe, because there were still, I mean, they weren't really peasants at that point. They were basically small holding capitalists, rural capitalists, small petty farmers. But they teamed up with urban working class people, got them the majorities they needed before, during, and after the Second World War. And it was rocky over the course of a number of years. And you don't really get Nordic social democracy until later into the late 50s and 60s. And that's where we say 70s is that's where you want to be in life. 74 and in Oslo or something that's peak life.
When people say the 70s are peak life, they're not talking about Oslo, but yeah, that's absolutely that's, and of course, again, these are things that are results of contingent historical processes, it's not etched into the laws of nature or whatever. They're political decisions. There are, people with different incentives who either win or lose at different junctures. And there was that point, in the mid 70s, when there was actually, I think the way they were doing it couldn't have worked, right? I don't think the Minder plan could have actually. I don't think you could transition to socialism in that way, but you had such a wildly successful social democratic program that it actually was faced with something of a juncture between, do we go further and fundamentally change the ownership relations of society, which is what Minder plan would have been, or do we go backwards and allow for some market reforms? And
Also,
yeah.
I meant to say Stockholm, not Oslo. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, right.
But Ben, I think it's actually I mean, Minder plan didn't win, but I actually think that they lost not because they were bound to lose, but because they lost like a fight. Like I actually think like
I think there are two questions. One, why did it lose? And then the other one is if it had won politically at that juncture, right? Like would that plan have actually worked in the long term?
Right.
And I'm not super sold on the second part, that you could have had this sort of very, very, very slow transition to, workers, union pension funds owning more and more of the economy, and that it would have played out that way. But certainly in the context, it's not like they tried it and it didn't work. Right. It was never tried because it was defeated politically. But the point is that you were getting to the point where those basic questions about ownership were being posed, right? That these are the two arguments for going beyond social democracy, to completely post-capitalist society. One of them is ideological. Those Eric Oldright normative principles. You shouldn't have to depend on selling your labor to a capitalist, to meet your basic needs. You shouldn't give up your autonomy in the workplace. That's the ideological argument. But then there's also the practical argument, which, something else, I remember Michael Brooks saying probably while he was summarizing something that Bhaskar just said to him in an interview. I don't remember the exact context. But I remember Michael saying, using the analogy, right, at a certain point to protect the gains that you've already made, you have to start taking pieces off the board by taking away the economic power of capitalists, so they can't try to roll it all back. So yeah, I think that's absolutely right. But again, yes, those are things that were achieved by an extremely powerful labor movement. The idea that somehow the existence of the Soviet Union is the main thing that stopped, that led to those victories, or somehow allowed there to be that labor movement, or it wasn't crushed. There are plenty of other countries where it was totally crushed. See Chile in the same period, despite the existence of the Soviet Union. So I don't really buy that. And then again, if you think that you could only have successful workers' movements given the background presence of the Soviet Union in the Cold War, how did the Soviet Union come into existence? Like that, the Soviet Union didn't exist when the Soviet Union came into existence. So that would be a big problem on that view, right? The Soviet Union didn't exist in order to bring itself about. It had to not exist. I know this sounds like some medieval scholastic philosophy. The Soviet Union had to once not be in order to then be. I'm
going to need a diagram.
Okay,
right. Following them.
We'll work on it later, but. And yeah, the American labor movement is it's actually on an uptick lately, but the overall picture is definitely of decline over the last several decades, no doubt about that whatsoever. But also, none of this stuff is irreversible. None of it's just etched into the laws of nature. Look at where the labor movement was at in the 1920s. That was a thoroughly defeated movement. In most ways, and then you had the sit-down strikes in the 1930s, and and it came, and it became much stronger than it ever had been before. That's not to say that the same thing will happen, or even that's the most likely outcome. It's just to say that you can't just go from right now things are bad to they'll never ever be better. We could never ever have a strong labor movement again, or we can never ever have social democracy again. It sounds like maybe it sounds like it's so cynical that it must be true, but it's just not. I mean, it doesn't check out historically with how these things happen in the first place.
Yeah, this is all Yeah, that's pretty compelling. Yeah, I think that's some of these things just sound nice, and so they work in debates. But that's kind of the thing. Like whenever I watch these, I'm mostly thinking about how people can learn from these and win their own debates that they have with their dumb relatives or their lame friends, you know. And so watching this, I think the first thing I'm learning, just like listening to Cale right now, especially, and you talk about the history of this, the first thing is just know your shit and don't let the libertarian like lay down some nonsense and fail to get to it. And so like when Vivek first went back up for his second portion, he said, here's how you can, here's examples where we had economic growth and decreased inequality, so that's wrong. Let's remind you of what happened in social democracy in Scandinavia. So knowing your shit and not being a pushover obviously is step one to doing well in these debates. But the second part is what I was thinking watching this is knowing your libertarian, because as we were sort of saying, as I said at the beginning, like they're unpredictable. And they come in different strains, and they're kind of like socialists in that, like you can't just assume you know what they're going to say because it's broad enough that you can be completely blindsided when a guy like this says like, well, I support single payer healthcare, like, oh, a typical libertarian position, and then turns around and contradicts himself. But that's important, it's like whenever, as much as you can, even just Googling the person, if you're going to be getting into this, find out, are they a consistent, libertarian type, like Rothbard and von Mises or something? Are they more like, more politically smushy, like, maybe like Friedman or, like Munger here, or are they just weirdos, like Stefan Molyneux, and they kind of fit in that category, but they have like 60 other weird beliefs. That's the kind of thing I'm thinking just from this specific debate. Like Vivek was great, he didn't, surrender any points. He took the time to go back and correct ludicrous misrepresentations that the libertarian made. But also just dealing with like those weird turns, like what weird, inconsistent, baffling view are they going to have? Like that's something that's easy to have that debate moment where you're kind of dumbfounded, where you're like, well, it looks weak, even if you're not confused, if you're just dumbfounded by how inconsistent and shallow your debate opponent is. So I think just what I've learned from this specific evening's debate is like just the crucial value of knowing what specific libertarian stupid ideas you're going to be up against. Because otherwise, yeah, it's just curveballs. I mean, these guys have very little intellectual standards in the first place. So maybe it's not surprising that you get every kind of weird version of them. That's the thing I'm struck with most, besides obviously, knowing your shit so you don't fundamentally get out punched.
Yeah, I mean, I think Vivek started out very, very strong in the opening statement. That was really good. And then, yeah, I mean, I think he was a little bit nonplussed by Munger endorsing social democracy.
We all were.
As the because I mean,
that's a pretty incredible step. I mean, like they did a growth, they did a self-improvement.
I don't know. See, that's possible. I kind of hear this. This guy ran for North Carolina governor. My sister and her family are North Carolina people. I know that state pretty decently. Like America, for all of our awful right-wing political positions and things, Americans are still social democrats. Like Medicare for All doesn't just have 80% of Democrat support. It's half of Republicans. And so I think if you're someone like him and you're just trying to get those votes or get to that high enough percentage that you get to go on a TV debate, with our horrible partisan electoral system, I think he realized you need to throw in some social democratic red meat to actually get some working class Americans to listen to you, because they aren't actually going to go nuts for it over your godforsaken charter school agenda. So I hear that, and I kind of hear mushy, inconsistent, piecemeal views of a guy who's trying to run for a political office in a red state and failing. But who knows? It's unpredictable. That's the lesson.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that, okay, so like some libertarians debated way too many libertarians. I think I'm pretty good now at spotting the kinds, right? Like there are, you've got your Rothbardian anarcho-capitalists. I understand their deal. You've got your sort of like straight down the line, minimal night watchman state libertarians. I kind of understand their deal. But then you have your sort of Nick Gillespie kind of like, oh, I'm a pragmatic libertarians. And I have trouble tracking what those guys mean sometimes. Like, because they, like, I sometimes I don't feel like I know what their version of like Vivek's opening statement, where he's laying out the normative principles and all that. Like, I don't quite know what the equivalent would be for some of those guys. Like Jason Brennan is one of those. He's definitely sort of in the same category. Like, he's maybe somewhere in between that and like the Night Watchman State Libertarian. Like, I recently read his Intro to Libertarianism book, and it's like a little confusing in the same way, because like guys like that will say, well, I'm a libertarian, I believe in, I basically trust markets and I don't like the state and this and that. But, sometimes you need the state to do this and that. And like sometimes those loopholes are big enough that you could fit like Medicare for all through them. And it gets really hard to track where to, like, I sort of lose track of what those guys think and like how they relate to the normal political spectrum.
I mean, if you can fit Medicare for all through it, then I'm like, all right, let's team up, dude. Like, I'm honestly like, if you're a libertarian who supports Medicare for all, like, cool, like, let's fucking canvas together. I don't know.
No,
like,
no, for sure.
I think like there's to your point of like, what is the libertarian version? I mean, I think a lot of it ends up becoming, like Rob was saying, you get like this very folksy kind of presentation of a lot of what they're saying. And it has to just be like, part of it's just like because these people have like debate coaches, because of course they do. But part of it also is because like some of these libertarians like have no reason to be as confident as they are. Like, but there has to be something. But the Cato Institute probably has a division just for this. But but it's also like they have to smuggle in like, because they a lot of these people are also pretty anal about like, polling. Like, they know their ideas are not popular at all. Like, they understand that they really have to sell this like in a really convoluted way. Or to Rob's point, again, I don't know exactly Munger's personal political evolution or views or anything, but it's entirely conceivable that he or someone like him, someone in that same position, would move towards single payer just because it's politically more viable, because like you're going to end up like winning votes. And sounds like he likes democracy, so maybe he truly actually is like, maybe he's more of a populist. I don't know. Regardless, I don't know. But and the other thing is like, I was about to say this and I stopped myself because the other point was more important. But like, what distinguishes like us, like Marxists, from most other political ideologies is that like our politics really isn't about like a set of ideas. It's a set of like principles and a set well, there's principles, but like it's more importantly about like the actual actions that are happening in the world. Like, I look at a working class person that has, maybe some unsavory views on a number of issues. Like, they maybe, let's just like, obviously this is not all working class people, but like, let's just say you have like some racist, xenophobic working class person. My political worldview says that I can work with that person politically if we are able to get them to, to support or to do some kind of political action that's to the benefit of passing Medicare for all. Like, that's great. I don't really have to know what's in their head. I will never know what's in their head. And it really won't actually affect the outcome if their actions are actually in the, moving the ball towards Medicare for all. And like, at the level of like society, like our job on the left isn't to change hearts and minds. It's not to like get everyone to have the most perfect conception of the world in their head. We're not going to get socialism when everyone has become in their head a socialist. Like, that's some fucking Maoist shit for you. What we believe is that like you change, society through getting people to change their actions, or through collectively deciding to do something, and then that ultimately cumulatively leads to a change in the material conditions that people make decisions under. So that's what like, it's not there's so many different distinctions that are going on right now, but that's like another big fundamental distinction when we're talking about like the unicorns that Munger brought up, that like that's how a Marxist like Vivek is going to be approaching a political, like, collective action problem versus like libertarian.
Yeah, I mean, so I would, I guess I'd make a distinction between Marxism and socialism, right? So socialism, I would understand in much the same way that Vivek started with, that's like ultimately calling yourself a socialist is about your normative goals, that you have, you don't think, that anybody should have to sell their labor to a capitalist to make ends meet. You think everybody's basic needs should be met, and without that depending on the market, you think people should get to have some control over their lives as workers. That's made a socialist. That's about what your goals are. And of course, like, obviously that goes along with, it'd be super weird to have those normative goals and also not to, like, be very opposed to racism and sexism and all of those things, because, like, normatively it all stems from the same place. But then being then Marxism, I think of not less in normative terms than just as a descriptive theory of how history works, and how class society works. How it is that that capitalism came about in the first place, how it is that socialism could come about from capitalism. How political actors are influenced by their economic incentives, all that stuff, right? Like that stuff is what I think is what Marxism is.
Well, but that's I think that, Ben, I think that's only half, though, because that's the theory of transitioning between modes of production. That's saying, like, how did capitalism come about, and how could it potentially turn into something else? But, like, the other half is that we're also, like, trying to analyze the actual mode of production that we exist in.
So how does the capitalist mode of production work? How did it come about? How could it come out of being like the cease to exist in the future? How do classes work? And how does politics, does it play out? Influenced by class interests. All of that stuff, I think, is what Marxism is about. Socialism is about okay, socialism maybe is the name of mode of production, but I mean, say being a socialist, right, is about wanting whatever, is about wanting society to work in certain ways. But I certainly do take your point. I mean, I'd say that anybody who who wants to change the material world in the ways that I do, I'm happy to have them, regardless of what thoughts are in their heads. Also, I think that I've said some of this stuff recently on the show before, so I'm not going to belabor it. But I think that if you look at the actual existing history of the labor movement, to the extent that we are interested in changing hearts and minds, and making people less racist and less xenophobic and all of that stuff, I actually think that working together with them to achieve common goals that they can see as being in their interests is a much more effective strategy for doing that than just sort of denouncing people.
Yeah. I think what we're both describing is just this, like, how to actually be a materialist. And that's like, and I said Marxist because unfortunately not all socialists end up becoming Marxists or materialists, but, like, that's, I think, like, that's, like, really fundamental to, if you're going to have a viable socialist political project or worldview, like, you have to be a materialist about the world around you, about the conditions, about how to change the conditions.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, so we're past 11. I want to get everybody's final thoughts, but first, we do have a super chat question from LJ Wombology. How does embeddedness interact with state theory? Overall, does it contribute to or disrupt the broader political project? Don't answer, Cale. I think I'm just going to take a wild stab in the dark here and say that only Cale can probably answer this question, since I'm pretty sure he knows what the questioner is getting at, and I'm not at all sure that I do. Rob, feel free.
When I hear the word embeddedness, I'm thinking of, like, Karl Polanyi and like his notion of like, I don't know, but maybe I don't fucking know anything, dude. I'm like, I read a bunch, but like I have no formal training in any of this shit. These guys have degrees. I don't know.
Okay, but Rob's degree is in economics and mine is in analytic philosophy, and so I don't think either of us know what embeddedness really means.
If it is like, if you're talking about like, oh yeah, he said correct. It's Polanyi. Okay, shit, I haven't read this shit in years. I mean, I'm not a Polanyian. I think like he's descriptively useful, but I don't think he theoretically holds up. I'm a Marxist. I have a different conception of state theory.
What does he mean by embeddedness?
Shit, it's too late to do Polanyi. Let's do Polanyi like post game tomorrow.
Okay, LJ, we'll go back to it in the post game after the regular episode tomorrow. We will all hit the books and see if we can figure out what you're asking. But in any case, going back to this debate, final thoughts to wrap up on Chibber versus Munger, capitalism, socialism, neckties, etc. Rob?
Yeah, I like this one. We've watched a number of them just when I've happened to be around for the show. You never know how they're going to feel. I enjoyed this. I really feel like Vivek had the control of the floor and more or less held it. Like he was very prepared, very able to take apart specific claims that Munger made. Munger is kind of a clown in general, but I think he came through real well here. I think we should all hope to do this good, But again, this, you could see like the preparation. Obviously Vivek's a figure and he's been preparing for this stuff for years. But because debates have so much, like we've said, they have so much show business to them, and you're under these very tight time constraints. Yeah, the way Chibber like landed his 15 minutes, it was like one of those perfect gymnast landings during those Olympic events that I'm too scared to watch. Very impressive, So it just says, I mean, I feel like I say this all the time, but when you're doing debates, or even when you're just arguing with someone in front of other people, like you're doing it for the audience and for their edification, for persuading them, not for your specific points clearing. So in my mind, when I watch these, it tends to be, I don't want to say superficial, but there is an amount of like who's winning the Hollywood Bowl here in terms of who's coming off as being more knowledgeable, having better arguments, yeah, but just the smoothness you need to project when you're up there, like it's stupid how important it is, but I feel like it really is. So, my main takeaway from this is that if you're on top of your stuff and you know how to boil it down and not be too reliant on big Marxist vocabulary terms, you can do very well, even when you're up against some, folksy Southern failed third-party candidate, which is not so easy. But, it's all about being able to do that. Although, again, the one thing that Munger had over Vivek was that, cutesy charm in the opening. That is not a small thing, though. You do need fun. You need a funny opening. Not enough Marxists open with the joke. And I'm being playful, but I actually do think that, like there is, it's a debate about economics. If it's not fun in the very first moment, like you're going to be losing people, like even if they just, phase out or whatever. So make sure you have enough fun in your debate prep. I think that's my last little wrap up thing. You need fun. If you like fun in your socialism, check out, of course, I'm with Current Affairs, so I always want to recommend a very beautiful new issue out. I have an article in this. And it's fun. It's fun. It's freaking playful, for God's sake. And Chibbers does not come off as joyless, which I think that's the last and best thing you could say is that, like, just at least, seem like a fun person. And I like how he blew up at the idiot who said some inaudible sporting related question. He didn't seem like a dick, though. Like he got passionate, but he was still, he kept his cool in that moment. So that's my read on it. It's very surface level, but that's debates. It has a lot of surface.
In economics and economic sociology, embeddedness refers to the degree to which economic activity is constrained by non-economic institutions. That's what Wikipedia is saying, folks. I don't know. I think Polanyi is just very like kind of Bavarian. Like he's like a weird, like he's not quite Bavarian, but he's not quite Marxist. He's like acknowledging that there's a material world and that like economics has a political component and vice versa. That like they're not separate, but he doesn't make the final Marxist leap to say that like, you know, basically inequities are driven by like inequities and ownership rights, and that like when it comes to the state, you know, there isn't this automatic dual motion that Polanyi's talking about. I don't know if LJ's as a patron or not, so I just figured I would give him something.
Okay.
He paid money. I think for Chibber, I've been working on making him funnier. We'll get there one day. He's really funny in lectures, I got to be honest, but I think it's hard for the left because, you know, we're the ones challenging the status quo, and we have to therefore cover every single base. So within 15 minutes, Chibber has to have like a full theory of socialism, capitalism, of transition. And he has to make the case empirically, you know, for how, you know, how capitalism limits collective action, how capital captures the state. So like the thing is, like he's like probably the only one on the left who can do it that much information in 15 minutes. And so we should all aspire to try to be that much better. And then, like Rob's saying, you know, sneak in a couple more jokes because people like to laugh. But I don't know. I find this really instructive, and it's a weird debate because the libertarian is not like the he's a weirdo. But
yeah,
I enjoyed it. I hope you guys did.
Yeah, it was great.
I definitely enjoyed that. I think, I mean, I think if I'd been arguing with Munger, I would have just given my own you know, interests and maybe bad habits and obsessions. You know, I would have had a hard time not like spending most of it talking about the sort of general things he was saying about poverty and inequality, because this stuff drives me crazy. There are tons of reasons to care about economic inequality besides you know, like besides absolute poverty, and also the idea that capitalism just sort of naturally gets rid of poverty is asinine. You know, we talked about some of the ways earlier, but also just like there's such a weird leap from as you develop the forces of production, right? As society becomes more productive, like some of the most extreme forms of poverty that can exist are curbed. There's such a weird leap from that to what people who say these things generally like want to imply, which is enough of it and everybody's going to be living a comfortable middle class existence, which is just obviously these are not the same thing, right? You don't get that kind of mass vaulting up into that comfortable existence just from like letting markets play out. That's never happened and never will happen. But like, so that's just an empirical point. And also there are lots of reasons to care about economic inequality. You know, we talked about, you know, the sense of community stuff earlier. There's also, you know, it's also incredibly important because of a sort of fundamental thing like that we spent a lot of time talking about earlier, which is just that economic inequality always leads to political inequality. That, you know, you're not going to have equality of political influence, you know, if you have substantial you know, like substantial economic, you know, inequality. I mean, you can have a little bit of variation in, you know, income maybe, but, you know, but certainly not like staggering levels and have anything like, you know, political equality, which is a especially important point for Munger, given that he wants to make this, oh, it's not capitalism, that's fine. It's just that we don't have enough democracy politically. Points like, yeah, you don't have enough democracy politically because of capitalism. Like that can be, you know, remedied to a certain extent within capitalism. But I mean, like the natural dynamics of capitalism are you know, massively fuel that problem. That yeah, if you get to decide how the surplus is divided up, then yeah, no kidding, you're going to give yourself way more than you're going to give workers who have less to go, who don't have very much bargaining power as individuals, and so you're going to have massive political inequality. It's also just like gross and arbitrary, that some people should get massively better lives than other people, because of their class, their position, within an economic hierarchy. Whether that's because of what kind of family they're born into, or because they happen to be born with some particular set of skills, or whatever, and that's objectionable in itself. I mean, if I have if we start out, with most people only having one crumb, and then you just through the process of economic development, most people have 3 crumbs. Yeah, that's good. That's an improvement. But also, if by restructuring the system, it would be possible to give everybody like a substantial meal, right? Then that would be better. And that's where the question of equality comes back in. So it would have been very hard for me debating Munger not to sort of obsess about that. But I like this one. I like this debate because I think that what Chibber is laying out, especially in the opening statement, it's a good it's not. I think there are a few different things you could do in debates, and that they're good for, and one of them is like really showing up the other person, like really showing like, hey, that this guy, his argument is completely incoherent. His like none of this makes any sense. And another thing that you can do, and these are not mutually exclusive. Usually, people are trying to do at least a couple of them. But is the thing, that Elizabeth Brunig line about how like half the point of debate is to get the other person to tell you what they really think. Like Sam Cedars' libertarian debates, are very often all about this, right? He's like drawing them out to the point where they actually say out loud the grotesque and anti-human consequence of their ideology. Yaron Brooks saying, we should, it's the fault of those people in Miami because they should have like researched the safety record, of those developers bar, before.
That's right. Yeah, we discussed that. Yeah, just recently. Yeah, that was a perfect example. Yeah, and that's some of the debate genius of Sam Cedar. No wonder Crowder ran away and had his lungs collapse in fear. I mean, you could see why. Like when you know how to do that. Like I think Brunig. Yeah, that's a really good point. Like I always say, like you're kind of wanting to decoy them a little so they show themselves more. Like that's the same thing. Yeah. Which enough views, it's not too hard.
Yeah, which is often the thing, right? So it's like the first one is like this sort of like get in, like the person who's like the huge nerd who's like really tracking every part of the argument, getting, is sort of winning them, right? So, oh no, none of this makes any sense. The second one is convincing people on a much more visceral level, like oh, these sort of libertarian general principles sound good, but it's probably going to sound a lot less good when we explicitly draw out what this actually means. But then, like, I think Chibber is doing a third thing in this debate, especially in that opening statement, which is that he's trying to give people a comprehensive understanding of what left politics are about and what motivates them and what the vision is and how, and how socialists think that vision, could actually come about, and I think it's, I mean, whatever. I mean, I think that I think there are good ends that are served by any of these things, but I think it's really good to have at least some people approach these things the way that Chibber does, because like the great advantage of this debate is, you could be somebody who had never cracked open, even digitally, a Jacobin or current affairs article in their lives. Who'd never met somebody who was in the DSA or whatever, and this could be your first exposure to these ideas, and you would get a pretty comprehensive idea of what they were, you know, which is a, I think, probably an underappreciated like goal to have in this kind of encounter, because of course most people are in that circumstance, right? I mean, like we live in a fallen world, and you know, the majority of the populace has never once read a single Jackman article. So if you're in that unlucky position and you happen to watch this thing, maybe because, you know, God knows, maybe because you're a fan of Munger, you know, there must be a few, or, you know, or you're just curious, like the in-person event, you just showed up because you thought the topic sounded interesting. You could show up to this and you could actually get like a really thorough idea, like what are the normative principles, how do those apply to what's wrong with, you know, with capitalism as it exists today, what's a sort of concrete program for doing something about it, and how do we think that program could be implemented, and you would know all of that stuff. And he did it without, you know, without like throwing in a lot of esoteric terminology, like Rob was saying. So,
it's,
you know, good job.
No bullshit, analytically clear, bread and butter socialism. That's your formula.
Pretty good.
Yeah, well, I like that. All right, guys. So tomorrow night we'll be back for the regular episode. It's going to be a foreign policy fest with Derek Davison and Danny Bessner.
And we're finally taking down Carl Polanyi after all these years. He's finally getting what he deserves.
And then we'll get into embeddedness and whatnot in the post game for patrons. So good stuff coming all around. Thank you guys. This was a lot of fun. Left is best.